Hello, everyone. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So, if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes, and let's begin. Story 1. The Nebraska Loop. Moving trucks were never Dave's favorite assignment, but the money was good, and the routes often took him through parts of the country he wouldn't otherwise see. This particular run was a long-distance household move, a family relocating from Denver to Boston, with all their worldly possessions loaded into the back of Dave's international truck. The customer had paid for expedited service, which meant minimal stops and maximum driving time within DOT regulations. Dave had been making good time across Colorado and into Nebraska, maintaining steady speed on the interstate highways that connected America's major population centers. Nebraska was always a challenge for long-distance drivers. Mile after mile of farmland and prairie, with limited services and monotonous scenery that could induce the kind of highway hypnosis that made accidents inevitable if drivers weren't careful. But this particular stretch of Nebraska was different in ways that Dave couldn't quite articulate. He'd been driving through the state for about 3 hours, maintaining his usual pace and monitoring his fuel consumption, when he began to notice that the landscape wasn't changing the way it should. At first, Dave attributed the sensation to the natural similarity of Nebraska farmland. Cornfields looked like cornfields, grain elevators looked like grain elevators, and small farming communities shared architectural and design elements that could make them seem nearly identical to a driver passing through at highway speed. But as the hours passed, Dave became increasingly certain that he was seeing the same landmarks repeatedly, the same distinctive red barn beside a curved section of highways, the same water tower with faded lettering that he couldn't quite read, the same cluster of farm buildings arranged around a gravel driveway that curved away from the road. Dave checked his GPS system, confirming that he was making progress toward his destination. The mile markers were advancing normally, his estimated arrival time was updating appropriately, and all his navigation equipment indicated that he was traveling east across Nebraska at normal highway speed. But his eyes were telling him something different, that the scenery outside his windows was repeating itself in ways that defied geographical logic. The sensation became more pronounced as Dave continued driving. It wasn't just that the landscape looked similar. It was that specific, identifiable landmarks were appearing multiple times. The red barn, the water tower, the farm buildings, a particular arrangement of hay bales, even the cloud formations in the sky seemed to be cycling through the same patterns. Dave tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe fatigue was affecting his perception, making him think he was seeing repetition when he was actually observing normal variations in rural landscape. Maybe the similarity of Nebraska farmland was playing tricks on his depth perception and pattern recognition. Maybe the hypnotic effect of long-distance driving was creating false memories that made new sights seem like repeated ones. But the feeling persisted and intensified. Dave began to experience what he could only describe as temporal displacement, a sense that he hadn't just been driving through Nebraska for 3 hours, but that he had always been driving through Nebraska, that this stretch of highway was his permanent reality, that he would continue seeing the same landmarks forever, that his truck was trapped in some kind of geographical loop that had no beginning and no end. The sensation was accompanied by a growing panic, that Dave had never experienced during his 15 years of professional driving. He felt like he was becoming unstuck from normal time and space, caught in a repetitive cycle that would continue indefinitely. The idea of spending eternity driving the same stretch of Nebraska highway filled him with a claustrophobic terror that made it difficult to concentrate on basic driving tasks. Dave tried his CB radio, hoping to make contact with other drivers who might be experiencing similar phenomena. Breaker 19, this is eastbound I-80, mile marker 126. Any drivers in the area notice anything unusual about the scenery today? Static answered him, along with the distant chatter of drivers on other highways hundreds of miles away. But no response came from anyone in his immediate area. No confirmation that other travelers were experiencing the same temporal displacement. Dave tried his cell phone, thinking he might call his dispatcher or his wife, but found that he couldn't remember their phone numbers. Not that he'd forgotten them temporarily. It was more like the numbers had never existed. Like his life outside this Nebraska highway was becoming increasingly unreal and distant. The GPS continued showing progress, but Dave began to doubt its accuracy. How could he be advancing mile by mile toward his destination while simultaneously experiencing the same landmarks repeatedly? How could time be passing normally while his perception told him that no time was passing at all? Dave forced himself to focus on concrete, measurable details. His fuel gauge was dropping normally, indicating that the truck was consuming diesel at the expected rate. His engine temperature and oil pressure were stable. His speedometer showed consistent highway speed. All the mechanical indicators suggested that he was operating normally in normal reality, but his sensory experience contradicted all the mechanical evidence. Dave felt like he was trapped in a dream where movement was an illusion, where progress was impossible, where the same stretch of Nebraska highway extended infinitely in all directions. The experience lasted until Dave crossed the Nebraska-Iowa border, where the sensation of temporal displacement ended as suddenly as it had begun. The Iowa landscape looked different, felt different, progressed normally as Dave continued east toward his delivery destination. The feeling of being trapped in an endless loop disappeared, replaced by normal highway driving through changing scenery. Dave completed his delivery in Boston without further incident. But the experience in Nebraska had shaken him more than any mechanical breakdown or weather emergency he'd ever encountered. He'd experienced a fundamental breakdown in his perception of space and time, a dissolution of the normal relationship between effort and progress that made long-distance driving possible. Dave reported the experience to his dispatcher, but framed it as possible fatigue-related disorientation, rather than describing the full extent of his temporal displacement. How could he explain that he'd experienced what felt like eternity while driving across a single state? How could he convey the terror of feeling trapped in an endless repetition of the same highway mile? The incident changed how Dave approached long-distance driving, especially through regions with repetitive scenery. He began taking more frequent breaks, varying his routes when possible, and paying closer attention to signs of perceptual distortion that might indicate developing problems with highway hypnosis. But Dave never forgot the sensation of being trapped in the Nebraska loop. Never stopped wondering if other drivers had experienced similar temporal displacement on highways where the landscape seemed to repeat itself endlessly. The road, he realized, was more than just a physical pathway between locations. It was also a psychological space where perception could become disconnected from reality, where the mind could become lost in patterns that defied normal understanding of time and distance. Some stretches of highway Dave learned that day weren't just geographically challenging. They were existentially challenging, testing a driver's grip on reality itself. And sometimes the greatest danger on the road wasn't mechanical failure or bad weather, but the possibility of becoming unstuck from normal time and space, trapped in repetitive cycles that offered movement without progress, travel without arrival. The Nebraska Loop reminded Dave that consciousness itself was fragile, that the human mind's understanding of space and time could be disrupted by factors as simple as repetitive scenery and extended isolation, and that sometimes the most important thing a driver could do was maintain faith that the road actually led somewhere, even when all evidence suggested otherwise. Story 2. The Fog Incident. Christmas week always brought out the best and worst in freight transportation. Retailers were desperate to move merchandise, manufacturers were pushing to clear inventory, and drivers like Marcus were pulling double shifts to meet delivery deadlines that could make or break their carriers. Relationships with major customers. This particular run was typical of the season's urgency. A trailer full of Spider-Man action figures that needed to reach Louisville by Christmas Eve morning for last-minute distribution to Costco stores across the region. Marcus had been driving for Midwest Express for 9 years, and he'd learned that holiday freight was both a blessing and a curse. The money was excellent. Holiday surcharges and expedite fees could double a driver's normal pay. But the pressure was intense, and the tolerance for delays was zero. Missing a Christmas delivery could cost a carrier their contract and a driver their job. The route from the toy manufacturer in Illinois to the Costco distribution center in Kentucky normally took about 6 hours. But Marcus was making excellent time on Route 265. Traffic was light. The weather was holding clear, and his truck was running smoothly. He'd even built in some buffer time for unexpected delays, which meant he could afford to take his time through the winding sections, where Route 265 cut through rural Kentucky's hill country. It was just past 3 a.m. when Marcus encountered the fog. At first, it appeared as wisps of ground fog in the valleys, normal for this time of year in Kentucky, where temperature differences between hills and hollows could create localized weather conditions. But as Marcus descended into a particularly deep valley, the fog thickened rapidly, reducing visibility from miles to yards in a matter of seconds. Marcus immediately reduced his speed and turned on his hazard lights, following standard procedures for driving in fog. His training had emphasized that fog was one of the most dangerous weather conditions for commercial vehicles. It could hide obstacles, distort depth perception, and create situations where accidents became inevitable, even at reduced speeds. But this fog was different from anything Marcus had encountered in his 9 years of professional driving. It wasn't just thick, it was complete, reducing visibility to literally zero. Marcus couldn't see his own hood, couldn't see the road markings, couldn't even see the glow of his own headlights. It was like driving through cotton batting or being underwater in murky liquid. Marcus brought his truck to a complete stop and set his emergency flashers, reaching for his CB radio to warn other drivers about the hazardous conditions. But when he keyed the microphone, nothing happened. No static, no background noise, no transmission indicator light. His CB radio had gone completely dead. Marcus tried his cell phone, thinking he should call 911 to report the dangerous fog conditions, but found that he had no signal. Not just low signal, no signal at all, as if his phone had lost all connection to the cellular network. The device showed no bars, no carrier identification, nothing. Then Marcus noticed that his truck's electrical systems were failing. His headlights dimmed and went out. His dashboard lights faded to black. His engine coughed once and died, leaving him sitting in complete silence in the middle of what appeared to be an impenetrable fog bank. Marcus tried to restart the engine, but nothing happened when he turned the key. No starter engagement, no electrical response, no indication that the truck's systems were receiving power. It was as if every electrical component in his rig had simultaneously failed. Sitting in the absolute darkness and silence, Marcus began to hear something that made his blood run cold. Somewhere in the fog around his truck, a child was crying. The sound was faint at first, almost lost in the oppressive quiet that had settled over the valley, but it gradually became clearer. The unmistakable sound of a young child sobbing, frightened and alone. The crying seemed to come from directly outside his truck, as if someone was standing just beyond his door. Marcus's first instinct was to help. Despite the electrical failures and the dangerous fog, someone's child was in distress, and his duty as a human being was to provide assistance. But something about the crying made him hesitate, something in the tone that didn't sound quite right. As Marcus listened more carefully, the child's crying began to change. The pitch shifted gradually, becoming deeper and more adult, transforming from the innocent distress of a lost child into the desperate weeping of a grown woman. The sound remained heartbreaking, but now it carried undertones of despair and hopelessness that made Marcus think of someone mourning a profound loss. Marcus reached for his door handle, intending to investigate despite his growing unease. But before he could open the door, the woman's crying began to change again. The desperate sobbing gradually transformed into something else. Laughter that started as relief, but quickly became something darker and more disturbing. The laughter grew louder and more maniacal, losing any connection to human emotion and becoming something that spoke of madness and malevolence. It seemed to come from all directions now, surrounding his truck like an audio net designed to trap him in a web of supernatural terror. Marcus sat frozen in his driver's seat, listening to laughter that seemed to feed on his fear and grow stronger with each passing second. The sound was no longer coming from outside his truck. It was inside his cab, inside his head, inside his very consciousness. And the more frightened Marcus became, the louder and more triumphant the laughter grew. Just when Marcus thought he might lose his sanity entirely, the laughter stopped. Complete silence returned to the valley, broken only by the sound of Marcus's own terrified breathing. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the fog began to clear. Visibility returned gradually, revealing the familiar landscape of Route 265 and the normal night sky of rural Kentucky. Marcus's electrical systems came back online simultaneously. Headlights, dashboard lights, CB radio, cell phone signal. His engine started immediately when he turned the key, running as smoothly as if nothing had happened. Marcus sat in his idling truck for several minutes, trying to process what he'd experienced. The fog, the electrical failures, the progressively disturbing audio phenomena. None of it made sense, according to any natural explanation he could imagine. Weather didn't cause total electrical failure. Fog didn't carry disembodied voices, and certainly nothing in his experience had prepared him for the supernatural progression from child's crying to woman's weeping to maniacal laughter. Marcus checked his CB radio and found normal chatter from other drivers on Route 265. He tried calling out, "Breaker 19, any drivers southbound 265, around mile marker 78. Did anybody else hit that fog bank back there? Negative on any fog, southbound truck, clear and dry from here to Louisville." Marcus called his dispatcher when he reached the Costco distribution center. But how could he explain what had happened? That his truck had been disabled by supernatural fog, while ghostly voices tormented him, with audio that progressed from innocence to despair to madness. Instead, he reported a brief mechanical problem that had delayed him slightly, keeping the supernatural elements to himself. Marcus completed his delivery on schedule and continued his career with Midwest Express. But the fog incident had changed his relationship with Route 265 and with night driving in general. He found himself more alert to unusual weather conditions, more sensitive to electrical anomalies, and more aware of the possibility that the road could hold experiences that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. The Christmas delivery of Spider-Man action figures was completed successfully, but Marcus never forgot the lesson of that night in rural Kentucky. Sometimes the most dangerous obstacles on the highway weren't other vehicles or mechanical failures or even severe weather. Sometimes the danger came from forces that operated outside the normal rules of physics and logic. Forces that could trap travelers in pockets of supernatural terror, where the familiar became threatening and the innocent became malevolent. The fog had been more than weather. It had been a gateway to something that fed on fear and grew stronger with each moment of human terror. And Marcus had been fortunate to escape with nothing more than memories of an experience that would haunt him for the rest of his driving career. Because some fog, Marcus learned that night, doesn't just obscure visibility. Some fog obscures the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds, creating spaces where the impossible becomes inevitable and the terrifying becomes real. Story 3. The Invisible Passenger. The New York Thruway was one of those routes that tested every aspect of a professional driver's skills. Heavy traffic, aggressive car drivers, multiple toll plazas, and constant construction that could turn a routine trip into an endurance test. And he'd learned to navigate the challenges with the patience and professionalism that separated good drivers from great ones. This particular midnight run was taking him from a food processing plant in Rochester to a distribution center in Albany. David's reefer unit was running perfectly, maintaining the precise temperature control that kept his cargo valuable and his customers satisfied. David had stopped for fuel and a quick meal at the Flying J near Syracuse, completing the routine tasks that kept long-haul operations running smoothly. Fuel, food, bathroom break, equipment check, and logbook update. The fuel stop had taken about 30 minutes, putting him back on schedule for his early morning delivery in Albany. It was about 10 miles past the truck stop when David first felt like he wasn't alone in his truck. The sensation started as nothing more than a vague uneasiness, the kind of peripheral awareness that made him glance in his mirrors more frequently than usual. But as the miles passed, the feeling intensified into something that couldn't be dismissed as imagination or phage-induced paranoia. David felt like someone was sitting in his passenger seat, not someone he could see. When he looked directly at the passenger seat, it was empty. But his peripheral vision and his instinctive awareness of personal space insisted that another person was sharing his cab. It was the same feeling he'd experienced as a child when he was certain someone was standing behind him, even though turning around revealed empty space. David tried to rationalize the sensation. 12 hours of driving could play tricks on anyone's perception. Maybe the vibration of the road was creating sounds that his brain interpreted as breathing. Maybe the movement of air conditioning was generating subtle pressure changes that felt like another person's presence. But the feeling persisted and grew stronger. David became increasingly certain that he could sense someone breathing in rhythm with his own respiration, someone shifting weight in the passenger seat when he took curves, someone sharing the confined space of his cab in ways that were impossible to ignore. David pulled over at the next rest area and conducted the most thorough truck inspection of his career. He checked every compartment, every storage area, every possible hiding place where an unauthorized passenger might have concealed themselves. He examined his sleeper berth, his toolboxes, even the space behind his driver's seat where someone might have hidden during his fuel stop. Nothing. His truck was empty except for himself and his cargo, but the sensation of invisible companionship remained as strong as ever. David sat in his driver's seat for 10 minutes, concentrating on the feeling, trying to understand what his senses were telling him. The presence felt male, probably middle-aged, sitting quietly in the passenger seat without any apparent malevolent intent. David couldn't see him, couldn't hear him, couldn't smell him, but every other sense insisted that another person was sharing his journey through the New York night. David resumed driving, but now he was hyper-aware of every sensation in his cab. Each time he changed lanes, he felt the invisible passenger lean slightly in response to the centrifugal force. Each time he braked, he sensed weight shifting forward in the passenger seat. Each time he accelerated, he felt someone settling back against the seat cushions. The sensation was so convincing that David found himself talking to his invisible passenger, carrying on one-sided conversations that helped pass the miles and made the presence feel less threatening. "Looks like we're making good time," he'd say, or "traffic's pretty light for a weeknight," treating the invisible presence like a travel companion rather than a supernatural phenomenon. David stopped twice more during his run to Albany, conducting additional inspections of his truck and trying to understand what was happening to him. An empty truck with no explanation for the persistent sensation of invisible companionship. The feeling remained constant until David reached his delivery destination, where it disappeared as suddenly as it had begun. As soon as David backed up to the loading dock and shut off his engine, the sensation of another presence vanished completely. His cab felt normal again, occupied only by himself and the familiar sounds and smells of professional trucking. David completed his delivery and found a nearby truck stop where he could take his mandatory rest break before the return trip. But sleep was elusive, interrupted by questions about what he'd experienced during the drive from Syracuse to Albany. Had he suffered some kind of psychological breakdown brought on by stress and fatigue? Had carbon monoxide or other fumes affected his perception? Had he experienced a supernatural encounter with some kind of ghostly hitchhiker? David never found a satisfactory explanation for his invisible passenger, but the experience changed how he approached long-distance driving. He became more aware of the psychological challenges of isolation and extended driving periods, more conscious of the ways that the mind could create perceived reality in response to sensory deprivation and monotonous stimulation. But David also became more open to the possibility that the highways held mysteries that couldn't be explained by conventional understanding. Professional drivers spent hundreds of hours alone in confined spaces, traveling through landscapes where the boundary between reality and imagination could become blurred. Maybe the roads attracted spiritual energy, or maybe extended isolation made drivers more sensitive to presences that were always there, but usually unnoticed. David continued driving the New York routes, continued hauling freight through the Empire State's challenging highway system. But he never forgot his invisible passenger, never stopped wondering if lonely highways attracted the spirits of travelers who'd never reached their final destinations. Because the road, David realized, was more than just a physical pathway between points on a map. It was also a spiritual journey where living travelers shared space with the memories, dreams, and perhaps souls of everyone who'd ever made similar trips. And sometimes, those spiritual passengers made their presence known to drivers who were sensitive enough to feel them and brave enough to acknowledge their existence. The invisible passenger had been real enough to David, whether explained by psychology, physiology, or supernatural phenomena. And that reality had reminded him that the highway was full of travelers, some visible and some not, all sharing the endless American journey toward destinations that might be geographical, spiritual, or somewhere in between. Some rides, David learned that night, carried more passengers than the manifest showed. Story 4. The Phantom Truck on Fire. The Rocky Mountain descent on Interstate 70 was one of those stretches of highway that separated experienced mountain drivers from everyone else. The grade was steep enough to challenge even the most powerful trucks. The curves were sharp enough to demand constant attention, and the consequences of mechanical failure or driver error could be fatal. Bob had been running freight through these mountains for 16 years, and he'd learned to respect the terrain with the caution that kept professional drivers alive. This particular November evening found Bob working his way down the western slope of the Rockies with a load of construction equipment bound for a job site in Grand Junction. His truck was heavy, close to the 80,000-pound legal limit, which meant that brake management would be critical throughout the descent. Bob had already downshifted to keep his engine working as a brake, and he was monitoring his brake temperature carefully to avoid the kind of overheating that could lead to brake failure. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, creating the kind of spectacular mountain scenery that made trucking through Colorado one of the most beautiful jobs in America. But Bob's attention was focused on the technical challenges of the descent rather than the scenic views. Mountain driving required constant vigilance, continuous monitoring of equipment performance, and split-second decision-making that could mean the difference between safe passage and disaster. Bob was maintaining a steady 35 miles per hour down a particularly steep section when another truck blew past him in the left lane at what had to be 65 or 70 miles per hour. The sight made Bob's blood run cold. Passing on a mountain descent at that speed was suicide. No truck could maintain control through the curves ahead while traveling that fast, and the grade would only add speed as the descent continued. Bob immediately reached for his CB radio to warn the other driver about the dangerous situation he was creating. Breaker 19 westbound truck that just passed the construction equipment hauler, you need to slow down immediately. You're going way too fast for this grade. No response came back, but Bob could see the other truck's taillights ahead of him, still traveling at excessive speed through curves that demanded careful brake management and precise steering input. The truck appeared to be pulling a standard dry van trailer, and from what Bob could see in the fading light, it looked like a relatively new rig in good condition. But something was wrong with the trailer brakes. Bob could see sparks streaming from the trailer's wheels, bright orange sparks that indicated severe brake overheating. The trailer's brake drums were glowing red hot, visible even in the twilight, and the smell of burning brake linings was beginning to reach Bob's cab despite the distance between the trucks. Westbound truck with the trailer brake fire. You need to find an emergency escape ramp immediately. Bob called on his CB. Your brakes are on fire and you're losing stopping power. Still no response, but now Bob could see that the situation was becoming critical. The sparks from the trailer brakes were becoming larger and more numerous, and what had started as glowing brake drums was beginning to look like actual flames. The other truck was experiencing the kind of brake failure that killed mountain drivers, and the speed he was carrying would make any emergency maneuver nearly impossible. Bob expected to see the truck leave the roadway at any moment, either onto an emergency escape ramp if the driver was lucky and skilled, or off the mountainside if he wasn't. But instead, something happened that challenged Bob's understanding of physics and reality. The truck simply disappeared. Not crashed, not exploded, not even veered off the road. It just ceased to exist, as if it had never been there at all. One moment, Bob was watching a truck with burning brakes speeding down a mountain highway, and the next moment, the road ahead was empty. Bob immediately slowed down and scanned the roadway for signs of where the truck might have gone. Emergency escape ramps, guardrail damage, skid marks, debris, anything that might indicate what had happened to a truck that had been clearly visible just seconds before. Nothing. The highway was unmarked, the guardrails were intact, and the emergency escape ramps were empty. There was no evidence that another truck had ever been on the road, no trace of the brake fire that Bob had clearly seen, no indication of the disaster that had seemed inevitable. Bob pulled over at the next truck stop and reported the incident to both the Colorado State Patrol and his own dispatcher. He described what he'd seen in detail: the excessive speed, the brake fire, the sparks and glowing drums, the truck's sudden disappearance. But search efforts found no evidence of any truck accident, no reports of missing vehicles, no trace of the truck that Bob had tried to warn over his CB radio. The state patrol officer who took Bob's report was a veteran of mountain highway enforcement, and he'd seen enough strange incidents to take Bob's account seriously. But without evidence of an accident, without reports of missing drivers, and without any physical trace of the phantom truck, there wasn't much that law enforcement could do beyond noting the incident in their files. Mountain highways see a lot of unusual things, the officer explained to Bob. The terrain, the altitude, the isolation, they can all affect people's perception. But we've had other reports over the years of phantom vehicles, trucks, and cars that drivers swear they've seen, but that leave no physical evidence. The officer went on to explain that the Rocky Mountain region had a long history of phantom vehicle sightings, ghost cars from accidents decades past, phantom trucks that appeared and disappeared without explanation, spectral motorcycles that rode the mountain curves forever. Some were attributed to optical illusions created by mountain weather and lighting conditions. Others remained unexplained. The thing about mountain driving, the officer said, is that it's claimed a lot of lives over the years. Drivers who made mistakes, drivers whose equipment failed, drivers who just got caught in situations they couldn't handle. Maybe some of them are still out there, still trying to make it down the mountain, still fighting brakes that failed years ago. Bob completed his delivery in Grand Junction and continued his career as a mountain freight hauler, but he never forgot the phantom truck with burning brakes. The incident had reminded him that the highways held more than just living travelers. They also carried the memories, echoes, and perhaps spirits of everyone who'd ever faced the mountain's challenges. The phantom truck had been real enough to Bob, visible enough to generate genuine highway shadows. 40 Tales from America's Truckers, Story 5. Revolutionary War, Ghost. The Pennsylvania mountains have always been notorious among truckers for their steep grades and winding roads. But Danny had been running freight through these hills for 12 years and thought he'd seen everything they had to offer. The October night was crisp and clear, perfect visibility and light traffic, the kind of conditions that made the job almost pleasant. He'd been following a flatbed hauler for the past 15 miles, maintaining a safe following distance as they climbed through the Poconos toward Scranton. The other truck was making good time, hauling what looked like heavy machinery under tarps. Danny could see the driver, silhouetted in his cab, working the gears with the smooth efficiency of someone who knew these hills intimately. Danny's own load of frozen foods was lighter, but he'd learned long ago that it was better to follow an experienced mountain driver than to try to set your own pace through unfamiliar terrain. They'd just crested a particularly steep grade when Danny reached for another energy drink from his cooler. The caffeine and taurine had become his best friends during these overnight runs. Not exactly healthy, but a hell of a lot safer than falling asleep at the wheel. He was twisting off the cap when something caught his attention in his peripheral vision. A figure was standing among the trees at the edge of the roadway. Danny's first thought was that someone had broken down, maybe a hunter whose truck had gotten stuck in the soft ground near the tree line. But as his headlights swept across the figure, Danny realized this wasn't a stranded motorist. The man was wearing what appeared to be a military uniform, not modern camouflage, but an old-style blue coat with white crossed straps across the chest. He carried what looked like a musket across his shoulders, and his posture was unnaturally rigid, like a soldier at attention. The figure was staring directly at Danny's truck. Danny slowed down, trying to get a better look. In his 24 years of driving, he'd seen some strange things on America's highways. People in costumes heading to conventions, historical reenactors traveling to events, even the occasional escaped convict in stolen clothes. But something about this figure felt wrong in a way that made his skin crawl. The man was wearing a tricorn hat and what appeared to be knee-high boots. His uniform looked authentic down to the brass buttons and the way the coat hung on his frame, but it was his face that made Danny's hands tighten on the steering wheel. Even in the brief moment when his headlights illuminated the figure, Danny could see that the man's skin was pale as moonlight, and his eyes reflected the truck's lights like an animal's. As Danny's truck passed, the figure turned to watch him, moving with the mechanical precision of a wind-up toy. The man's head swiveled to track the truck's progress, but his body remained perfectly still at that rigid military attention. In his side mirror, Danny watched the figure continue, staring after him until the curve of the road cut off his view. Danny immediately reached for his CB radio. Breaker 19. Anybody else see that character back there in the trees? He cranked up the heat and took a long pull from his energy drink, trying to convince himself he'd just seen a reenactor taking a break from some historical event. Pennsylvania was full of Revolutionary War sites, and it wasn't uncommon to see people in period costume during the day. Maybe the guy was just a history buff who liked to dress up, out for a nighttime walk in the woods. But even as Danny tried to rationalize what he'd seen, he knew it didn't add up. The figure had been standing in dense forest, miles from any road or trail, in the middle of the night. No sane person would be wandering around these mountains in an antique military uniform at 2 in the morning, and certainly not while carrying what appeared to be a functioning musket. Danny tried the CB again. Any driver northbound on 370. This is the reefer hauling behind the flatbed. Just want to know if anybody else saw that fellow in the old soldier outfit back at marker 17. He waited, scanning through the channels, but found only static and the distant chatter of drivers on other highways. As he continued up the mountain, following the flatbed's taillights through the curves, Danny found himself checking his mirrors more frequently than usual. Each time he looked back, he half expected to see that rigid figure standing in the road behind him, watching his truck disappear into the night. The image was burned into his memory, the pale face, the reflective eyes, the unnaturally perfect posture of a soldier from another century. The rest of the run passed without incident. Danny delivered his load to a distribution center in Scranton, grabbed a few hours of sleep at a nearby truck stop, and started the return trip. But when he reached mile marker 127 on the southbound side, he found himself slowing down and peering into the trees. Nothing there now but darkness and the October wind rustling through the leaves. It wasn't until weeks later that Danny mentioned the encounter to another driver at a truck stop in Harrisburg. The other driver, a grizzled veteran named Carl, who'd been running Pennsylvania freight for 30 years, just nodded knowingly. "You ain't the first to see old George," Carl said, sipping his coffee. "Been spotted on that stretch for years. Some say he's a Revolutionary War soldier who died in these mountains, still patrolling his post. Others think he's just a trick of the light and shadow. But I'll tell you this, every driver who's seen him describes the exact same thing. Blue coat, musket, pale face, standing at attention like he's waiting for orders that ain't never gonna come." Danny never saw the figure again, but he never forgot that moment when his headlights swept across a soldier from 1776, standing guard in the Pennsylvania mountains 2.5 centuries after his war had ended. Some battles, he realized, never really finish. Some soldiers never get the order to stand down. And some roads carry more history than any map could ever show. Story 6. The High Desert Entity, the stretch of highway between. Tommy had run this route dozens of times over his 8 years driving for Southwest Freight Lines, but he'd never gotten comfortable with it, but not enough to disturb the hypnotic rhythm of his engine working through the gears. The Cummins 15-liter was running smooth as silk. At first glance, it looked like a breakdown situation, someone whose car had quit on them in the middle of nowhere, waiting for help that might not come until morning. Tommy had stopped for stranded motorists before. It was part of the unwritten code of the highway, but as he got closer, details began to register that made him ease off the throttle without quite knowing why. The man was wearing a suit, not work clothes, not the kind of casual outfit you'd expect from someone driving through the high desert. A full business suit, gray or charcoal colored, complete with what appeared to be a tie. He was standing perfectly still beside the road, not waving for help, not even acknowledging the approaching truck, just standing there, like he was waiting for a bus in downtown Manhattan instead of being stranded in the middle of the New Mexico desert. Tommy started to pull over, already reaching for his CB mic to call for emergency services, when something about the figure made him pause. The man's posture was wrong somehow, too rigid, too perfectly upright, and his face, even in the brief moment when his headlights illuminated the figure, Tommy could see that something wasn't right about the man's face. It looked smooth, almost featureless, like someone wearing a mask. The proportions seemed off too, as if the features had been painted on rather than naturally formed. Tommy's foot found the accelerator again, and he picked up speed as he passed the figure. In his side mirror, he caught a glimpse of the man turning to watch the truck go by, but the movement was too smooth, too fluid, like a mannequin being rotated on a stand. Jesus Christ, Tommy muttered, reaching for his CB. Breaker 19. Anybody else southbound on 380? Just past some character in a suit, standing by the road near mile marker 45. Something ain't right about this guy. Static answered him, along with a strange chirping sound that he'd never heard on the CB before. Not the usual squelch or the electronic beeping of emergency services. This was different, almost organic, like insects or birds trying to communicate through the radio. Tommy adjusted his squelch control and tried again. Anybody copy? Southwest bound on 380, looking for a radio check. More chirping, clearer now, coming in rhythmic bursts through his speakers. Tommy had been using CB radios for 15 years and had never heard anything like it. A pattern that almost sounded like language, like some kind of coded communication. Tommy switched channels and tried again, but the chirping followed him across the spectrum. Channel 19, Channel 17, even the emergency channel. Everywhere he tuned, those strange electronic insects were waiting for him. The sounds grew more intense as he passed the very large array. The radio telescope installation that locals just called the VLA. The massive dishes were silhouetted against the stars, like mechanical flowers turned toward some cosmic signal only they could hear. As he cleared the VLA, the chirping faded back to normal static, but Tommy's hands were shaking on the steering wheel. In the rearview mirror, the radio telescope installation was already disappearing into the darkness, but he could swear he saw lights moving among the dishes. Not the normal red navigation lights, but something else. And even then, he kept the truck running while he used the payphone at a 24-hour gas station to call dispatch. He tried to explain what he'd seen, but how do you tell someone that you passed a man in a business suit standing in the desert at midnight? A man whose face looked like it had been assembled rather than born. The dispatcher took down his report with professional courtesy, but Tommy could hear the skepticism in her voice. Drivers saw strange things on long hauls, especially at night. Fatigue, isolation, and the hypnotic effect of highway driving could play tricks on anyone's perception. It was probably just a stranded motorist in unusual clothes, she suggested. Maybe someone from the Air Force Base in Albuquerque whose car had broken down. But Tommy knew what he'd seen. And more importantly, he knew what he'd heard on that radio. Something that wasn't quite electronic and wasn't quite alive. Something that had used his CB to send messages he couldn't understand to recipients he couldn't see. He finished his run to El Paso and headed back north on I-25, taking the main interstate instead of the lonely stretch of highway where he'd encountered the figure in the suit. Tommy never drove that route again, and he never heard those chirping sounds on his radio again either. But sometimes, when he was running late at night through other empty stretches of the Southwest, Tommy would catch himself checking his mirrors for men in business suits and listening to his CB4 sounds that shouldn't exist. The high desert kept its secrets well, but once in a while it let truckers like Tommy glimpse the edges of mysteries that were better left alone. Some roads, Tommy learned that night, led to places that weren't marked on any map. Story 7. Guardian Angel Child. The Missouri Interstate stretched ahead of Rick like a ribbon of black velvet under the star-filled sky. After 14 hours behind the wheel, the highway hypnosis was starting to set in. That dangerous state where your body continues driving while your mind drifts away. Rick shook his head hard and reached for his thermos of coffee. Now cold, but still loaded with enough caffeine to keep his eyes open for the final push to Kansas City. He'd been running freight for Midwest Transport for 6 years, and this particular route from Memphis to KC had become routine. Auto parts, mostly, sometimes electronics, always time-sensitive loads that kept the manufacturing plants humming. Tonight's cargo was transmission components for a Ford assembly plant, and the delivery window was tight. No time for extended breaks, no time for anything but mile after mile of professional driving. Rick was checking his fuel gauge when he realized he'd made a mistake. The needle was hovering just above empty, and according to his trip computer, he was running on fumes. In his rush to make good time, he pushed past his usual fuel stop in Columbia, figuring he could make it to the Flying J in Kansas City. Now, with 60 miles still to go, he was cutting it dangerously close. Damn it, he muttered, scanning ahead for the green glow of a truck stop sign. The Missouri highway was lined with small towns and gas stations, but most of them would be closed at this hour, and the ones that stayed open might not have diesel or might not be able to accommodate a 53-foot trailer. Rick took the next exit, following signs toward a small town whose name he couldn't pronounce. The off-ramp curved down into darkness, past a cluster of grain silos and what looked like a defunct railroad depot. He was just starting to wonder if he'd made another mistake when he spotted the glow of a 24-hour truck stop about a mile ahead. Rick pulled off to check his route and plan his approach to the fuel island. The truck stop looked legitimate. A dozen pumps, a convenience store, and enough room to maneuver his rig without scraping the trailer on the canopy supports. But as he swung the truck around toward the diesel pumps, something made him pause. A little girl was standing near the edge of the parking lot. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old, wearing a white dress and small sneakers, standing perfectly still in the pool of light cast by the overhead fluorescence. Rick's first instinct was alarm. What was a child doing alone at a truck stop at 2 in the morning? Where were her parents? Was she lost, hurt, in some kind of trouble? Rick set his air brakes and climbed down from the cab, looking around for any sign of the child's family. The parking lot was empty, except for his truck and a couple of cars near the convenience store. Through the store's windows, he could see a clerk behind the counter, reading a magazine and apparently unaware of the child outside. "Hey there, sweetheart," Rick called softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you okay? Where's your mom and dad?" The little girl turned toward him, and Rick was struck by how calm she seemed. No tears, no signs of distress, just a serene expression that seemed unusual for a child in such circumstances. When she spoke, her voice was clear and confident, without the fear or uncertainty he would have expected. "Hi," Mr. Che said, smiling up at him. "My mommy says you'll be okay." "Don't worry." Rick stopped walking, confused by the child's words. "Your mommy, where is she, honey?" I don't see anyone else around." But when he looked up from the little girl's face to scan the parking lot again, she was gone. Simply gone, as if she'd never been there at all. Rick spun around, checking behind his truck, near the fuel pumps, around the corner of the building. Nothing. No child. No sound of running footsteps. No movement in the shadows. "What the hell?" Rick whispered, his skin crawling with goosebumps. He jogged over to the convenience store and pushed through the glass doors, the entry chime announcing his arrival. "Excuse me," he said to the clerk, a bored-looking teenager with earbuds in. "Did you see a little girl out there? White dress, maybe 7 years old?" The kid pulled out one earbud and looked at Rick like he was speaking a foreign language. "A little girl, dude. There's nobody out there but you. Been dead quiet all night." Rick bought a Coke he didn't want and returned to his truck, still shaken by the encounter. Children didn't just disappear into thin air, and they certainly didn't wander around truck stops in the middle of the night. But the fuel gauge was still showing empty, and Kansas City was still 60 miles away. He had to fuel up and get moving, mystery or no mystery. Rick pulled up to the diesel pump and began the familiar routine of fueling his rig. Fuel card, pump selection, nozzle in the tank. But when he squeezed the handle, nothing happened. The pump didn't start, didn't even register that a card had been inserted. Rick tried again, checking all the connections, following the instructions on the pump's display. Still nothing. He was about to go inside and ask for help when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The fuel gauge on his dashboard was no longer reading empty. In fact, it was showing nearly a quarter tank, enough to easily reach Kansas City, maybe even enough to make it to his regular fuel stop on the other side of town. But now his tanks were showing fuel that hadn't been there before, fuel that couldn't possibly exist. He climbed back into the cab and fired up the engine, watching the gauge carefully. The needle stayed steady at quarter tank, and the engine ran smooth and strong as he pulled away from the pump. Rick drove the 60 miles to Kansas City without stopping, and when he arrived at the Ford plant, his fuel gauge was showing exactly what it should have shown if he'd started the trip with a quarter tank instead of empty. Rick never figured out what happened that night at the Missouri truck stop. He never saw the little girl again, never found an explanation for the fuel that appeared in his tanks when he needed it most. But he kept the child's words with him. "My mommy says you'll be okay. Don't worry." Sometimes, Rick realized, the road provided exactly what you needed, exactly when you needed it. And sometimes that help came in forms that couldn't be explained, couldn't be rationalized, could only be accepted with gratitude and wonder. Guardian angels, Rick's grandmother used to tell him, didn't always look like angels. Sometimes they looked like little girls in white dresses, appearing just long enough to deliver a message of hope before disappearing back into the mystery from which they came. Story 8. The Phantom. On I-99, the Pennsylvania Manowans were notorious among truckers for their steep grades and treacherous curves. But Interstate 99 had always been one of the better routes through the region. Modern engineering had tamed most of the terrain's hostility, creating a highway that allowed heavy trucks to maintain reasonable speeds without burning up their brakes on the descents. Still, Dave had learned to respect these mountains during his 8 years hauling freight through the Keystone State. The weather could change in minutes, and the terrain always demanded attention. Tonight was running smooth, though. Clear skies, dry pavement, and light traffic made for ideal driving conditions. Dave's International was pulling a load of furniture from a factory in North Carolina to a distribution center in Pennsylvania, and he was making good time. His OS clock showed 2 hours remaining on his 14-hour duty period. Plenty of time to reach his destination and find a place to park for his mandatory 10-hour break. The digital clock on his dashboard read 11:47 p.m. when Dave's headlights picked up the figure in the road. It was a person. He could see that much immediately. Someone standing directly in the northbound lane, maybe 100 yards ahead, silhouetted against the darkness like a statue. Dave's first thought was that someone's vehicle had broken down and they were trying to flag down help. But something about the figure's position and posture made him uneasy. The person wasn't waving, wasn't moving at all, just standing there in the middle of the interstate like they were waiting for a bus instead of facing down 40 tons of rolling steel. Dave hit his air horn, 3 long blasts that echoed off the mountainsides, while simultaneously reaching for his brake pedal. The person didn't react, didn't step aside, didn't even appear to acknowledge the approaching truck. Dave's training kicked in, and he began the careful process of bringing his rig to a controlled stop. No sudden movements, no panic braking that could cause a jackknife or rollover. But as Dave's truck slowed, something strange happened to the figure in the road. It seemed to become less substantial, like it was fading away or dissolving into the darkness. By the time Dave had reduced his speed to 30 miles per hour, the figure was barely visible. By the time he reached the spot where the person had been standing, there was nothing there at all. Dave brought his truck to a complete stop and set his emergency flashers. His hands were shaking as he reached for his CB radio. Breaker 19, any driver northbound on I-99, mile marker 78, just had a pedestrian in the roadway. Anybody else see this? Static answered him, followed by a crackling response from a distant driver. Negative on the pedestrian, northbound truck. Road looks clear from here. Dave grabbed his flashlight and climbed down from the cab to inspect his truck. He'd felt no impact, heard no sound of contact, but he needed to be sure. In 40 tons of rolling truck, it was possible to hit something and not immediately realize it, especially if the object was small or the contact was glancing. He walked around his entire rig, tractor, trailer, both sides, front and back. The flashlight beam revealed nothing out of the ordinary. No damage to the bumper, no blood or clothing caught on the equipment, no sign that his truck had made contact with anything. Even the bug screen was clean, which was unusual for a truck that had been running through Pennsylvania's insect-rich mountain valleys. Dave stood in the middle of I-99, looking back at the spot where he'd seen the figure. The asphalt was empty, unmarked by any evidence of what had just occurred. No abandoned vehicle, no personal belongings, no indication that anyone had ever been there. The mountain silence was complete, except for the idle of his diesel engine and the distant hum of traffic on other highways. He tried his CB again. Any driver southbound I-99, this is the northbound International at marker 78. Did you see anybody walking on the highway? Pedestrian in dark clothing? Negative. Northbound International. Haven't seen anything but empty road for the last 50 miles. Dave climbed back into his cab and sat there for several minutes, trying to process what had happened. In his 8 years of professional driving, he'd encountered plenty of unusual situations. Drunk drivers, animals in the road, debris from accidents, even the occasional confused elderly person who'd wandered onto the interstate. But he'd never seen someone simply vanish like that, like they were made of mist instead of flesh and blood. The logical part of his mind tried to rationalize the experience. Maybe it had been a shadow cast by his headlights, a trick of perspective that created the illusion of a human figure. Maybe fatigue was affecting his perception more than he realized. Maybe the combination of darkness, unfamiliar terrain, and the hypnotic effect of highway driving had caused him to see something that wasn't really there. But Dave had been driving professionally for 8 years and personally for 20. He knew the difference between a shadow and a person, between fatigue-induced hallucinations and actual objects in the road. What he'd seen had been solid, three-dimensional, definitely human in shape and size. And then it had simply stopped being there. Dave put the truck back in gear and continued north, but his previous confidence in the night's routine had evaporated. He found himself checking his mirrors more frequently, scanning the road ahead with unusual intensity. Every shadow became a potential figure, every piece of roadside debris a possible sign of human presence. The rest of his run passed without incident. Dave delivered his load to the distribution center in Altoona, completed his paperwork, and found a parking spot at a nearby truck stop. But sleep came hard that night, interrupted by dreams of figures standing in dark roads, waiting for trucks that would pass right through them like they were made of nothing at all. It wasn't until the next morning, over coffee in the truck stop restaurant, that Dave mentioned his experience to another driver. The man, a Pennsylvania native who'd been running these mountains for 15 years, listened carefully to Dave's account before nodding thoughtfully. "You ain't the first to see something like that. These mountains have seen a lot of accidents over the years, especially before they built the interstate. Old Highway 22 used to run through here, and it was a killer. Narrow, winding, steep grades that would catch truckers off guard. Lost a lot of good drivers on that road." The man stirred sugar into his coffee and continued. "Some folks say the dead don't always realize they're dead, especially if it happened sudden-like. Keep trying to flag down help that ain't never gonna come, or trying to get home to families that moved away years ago. You probably saw one of them, some poor soul still standing in the road, waiting for someone to stop and help." Dave never drove I-99 again without thinking about that conversation. And on subsequent trips through those mountains, he made a point of scanning the roadway carefully, not for living pedestrians who might need assistance, but for the ghostly figures who might still be waiting for help that would never arrive. Because sometimes, Dave learned that night, the dead don't move on. Sometimes they stand in the middle of dark highways, as solid as life, until the moment you reach them, then fading back into the mystery from which they came. And sometimes the best thing a living driver can do is bear witness to their presence, acknowledge their continued existence, and carry their memory forward into the night. The mountains, after all, remember everything. And occasionally, they share those memories with travelers brave enough to drive their lonely roads. Story 9. The Donner Passed Christmas Guardian. Christmas week in the trucking industry meant one thing: controlled chaos. Every retailer in America was scrambling to move merchandise. Every distribution center was working around the clock. And every driver worth his CDL was pushing hard to make those critical holiday deliveries. Frank Torres had been running freight for 18 years, and he'd learned that the week before Christmas could make or break a carrier's relationship with their customers. This particular December 23rd found Frank at the Alamo truck stop near Sparks, Nevada, staring at the weather reports on his Qualcomm and trying to decide whether to push over Donner Pass before the storm hit. His load of electronics from California needed to be in Sacramento by Christmas Eve morning, and the only viable route was I-80 through the Sierra Nevada mountains, specifically over the infamous Donner Pass. The Weather Service was calling for heavy snow starting around midnight, with accumulations of 18 to 24 inches possible by morning. If Frank waited until the storm passed, he'd miss his delivery window and probably end up sitting in Nevada for 3 days while the highway departments worked to clear the pass. But if he tried to beat the storm and didn't make it, he could find himself trapped on a mountain highway with nowhere to go and no way to get there. Frank was studying his route options when another driver approached his table in the truck stop restaurant. The man was probably in his 60s, wearing a faded denim jacket and a baseball cap advertising a trucking company Frank didn't recognize. What caught Frank's attention, though, were the man's eyes, pale blue, almost transparent, with an intensity that seemed to look right through him. "You thinking about going over the pass tonight?" the stranger asked, sliding into the booth across from Frank without being invited. "Trying to decide," Frank replied carefully. Professional drivers were generally friendly people, but there was something about this man that put him on edge. "Weather looks pretty nasty, but I've got a hot load that needs to be in Sacramento tomorrow morning." The stranger nodded knowingly. "Donner Pass in winter. Been running that route for more years than I care to remember. Seen trucks buried so deep in snow that it took crews 3 days just to find them. Seen drivers freeze to death 50 yards from help because they couldn't see the help through the storm." Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Nevada winter. "You think I should wait it out?" The man's pale blue eyes seemed to look right into Frank's soul. "I think if you're trying to get home, you better go over the pass right now. Don't stop for coffee. Don't stop for fuel if you can help it. Don't stop for anything. That storm's going to come in harder and faster than the Weather Service thinks. And once it starts, that pass is going to be closed for a day and a half, maybe longer." Something about the man's urgency made Frank's decision for him. He paid his check, gathered his trip paperwork, and headed for his truck. As he was conducting his pre-trip inspection, he looked back toward the restaurant, intending to wave goodbye to the stranger who'd given him the advice. But the restaurant was empty, except for the waitress and a couple of other drivers Frank had seen earlier. The man with the pale blue eyes was nowhere to be seen. Frank fired up his Peterbilt and pulled out of the truck stop, heading west toward I-80 and the mountain pass that had given its name to one of the darkest chapters in American frontier history. The road was clear, the weather still holding, but Frank could feel the atmospheric pressure dropping and see the first wisps of high clouds beginning to obscure the stars. The climb up the eastern approach to Donner Pass was routine at first. Frank's truck pulled the grade easily, the Caterpillar engine working smoothly through the mountain curves. He passed several other trucks heading in the same direction, drivers who'd apparently made the same calculation about beating the storm. But the traffic was light enough that everyone could maintain good speed. Frank crested the pass at 11:23 p.m., just as the first snowflakes began hitting his windshield. Within minutes, the flakes had become a steady snowfall, and by the time he reached the chain-up areas on the western descent, the accumulation was already measuring in inches instead of flakes. Frank didn't stop to chain up. His truck was equipped with good winter tires, and he had enough experience in mountain driving to know how to manage the descent safely. More importantly, He remembered the stranger's words, "Don't stop for anything." Something deep in his gut told him that advice might be the difference between making it home for Christmas and spending the holiday trapped on a mountain. By the time Frank reached Sacramento at 3:17 a.m. on Christmas Eve, the snow on Donner Pass was falling so heavily that the California Highway Patrol had closed I-80 in both directions. The closure would last 36 hours, trapping dozens of trucks and hundreds of cars on the Nevada side of the mountains. Frank delivered his load on schedule, collected his paperwork, and found a motel room where he could grab a few hours of sleep before starting the long drive home to his family in Arizona. But as he drifted off, he found himself thinking about the stranger in the truck stop, the man with the pale blue eyes who'd known exactly when that storm would hit and exactly how severe it would be. It wasn't until Frank was back home with his family, watching his kids open their Christmas presents, that he mentioned the encounter to his wife. She listened to his story with the patient attention of someone who'd been married to a trucker for 15 years. But when he described the stranger's eyes, her expression changed. Pale blue eyes, she asked quietly. Really pale, almost like looking through ice. Frank nodded, puzzled by her reaction. "Yeah, why? You know someone like that?" His wife was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Your father had eyes like that. I only met him a couple of times before he passed, but I remember thinking they were the most unusual eyes I'd ever seen. Like they could see things other people couldn't." Frank's father had died in a trucking accident 12 years earlier, caught in a blizzard on a mountain pass in Colorado. Frank had always blamed himself for not being there, for not somehow preventing the accident that had taken his father's life. But now, thinking about the stranger's urgency and the way those pale blue eyes had seemed to look right through him, Frank wondered if his father had found a way to be there after all. Some debts, Frank realized, transcend death. Some promises to keep families safe extend beyond the grave. And sometimes, when the road ahead is dangerous and the stakes are high, help comes from directions you'd never expect, wearing faces you almost recognize, speaking with voices that carry the weight of love across impossible distances. Frank never saw the stranger again, but he never forgot those pale blue eyes or the urgency in the man's voice. And every time he faced a difficult decision on the road, he found himself asking, what would someone who loved me want me to do? Usually, the answer was clear. Usually, it led him safely home. Story 10. The Wedding Dress Ghost. The Ohio back roads were never Bill's first choice for making time, but sometimes dispatch routed you through places that made economic sense to the company, even if they didn't make sense to the driver. This particular load of agricultural equipment needed to get from a factory outside Columbus to a dealership in West Virginia, and the most direct route happened to wind through some of the most remote countryside in southeastern Ohio. Bill had been driving for Heartland Transport for 11 years, and he'd learned to appreciate the quieter roads even when they added time to his trip. Less traffic meant less stress, and the rural scenery was a welcome change from the endless concrete and truck stops of the major interstate routes. Besides, his delivery wasn't scheduled until tomorrow afternoon, so he had plenty of time to take the scenic route. It was just past 3 a.m. when Bill crested a hill on State Route 50 and saw the accident scene spread out in the valley below. An orange van was lying on its side, about 50 yards ahead, positioned sideways across both lanes of the narrow highway. Bill could see the vehicle clearly in his headlights. An older model conversion van, the kind families used for camping trips in the 1980s. The van's sliding door was open, and there was someone standing beside it. Bill immediately began the process of bringing his truck to a safe stop while reaching for his CB radio. Breaker 19. This is eastbound on Route 50, approaching mile marker 73. Got a vehicle rollover blocking the roadway, requesting emergency services and any available drivers to assist. Static answered him. Not unusual on these back roads where CB coverage could be spotty. Bill tried again as he downshifted and applied his brakes. Mayday, Mayday, Route 50 eastbound. Vehicle accident with possible injuries. Any station copy. Still nothing but static. Bill wasn't surprised. Cell phone coverage was probably non-existent out here too, which meant he might be the only help this accident victim was going to get for quite a while. He brought his truck to a complete stop about 30 yards from the overturned van and set his emergency flashers before climbing down from the cab. "Hey," he called out to the figure beside the van. "Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" As Bill got closer, he could see that the person was a woman wearing what appeared to be a white dress. Her back was turned to him, and she was standing perfectly still beside the van's open door. Bill assumed she was in shock. Accident victims often exhibited strange behavior, especially if they'd suffered head injuries or were dealing with the psychological trauma of a serious crash. "Ma'am, my name is Bill," he said, approaching slowly and keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "I'm a professional driver, and I'm here to help. Can you tell me if anyone else was in the vehicle with you?" The woman didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge his presence. Bill moved closer, close enough to see details that made his stomach clench with horror and sympathy. The white dress was a wedding dress, complete with lace sleeves and a long train that was now torn and dirty, and it was stained with what looked like blood. Dark patches across the bodice and skirt that were clearly visible even in the uncertain light of his truck's headlights. "Oh, Jesus," Bill whispered, realizing he was looking at the scene of a tragedy. A bride, probably heading home from her wedding or to her honeymoon, involved in a rollover accident that had clearly caused serious injuries. He needed to get medical help immediately, needed to assess her condition and provide first aid if possible. "Ma'am, I need you to sit down and stay calm," Bill said, reaching into his jacket for the first aid kit he always carried. "I'm going to check you for injuries, and then we're going to get you to a hospital." But when Bill looked up from his first aid kit, the woman was gone. Not just gone, vanished completely, as if she'd never been there at all. Bill spun around, checking behind the van along the roadside. Even under the overturned vehicle, nothing. No sign of the woman in the blood-stained wedding dress. No sound of footsteps moving away from the scene. And then Bill noticed something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The van wasn't damaged. There were no broken windows, no dents or scratches, no evidence of a rollover at all. The vehicle was lying on its side, but it looked like it had been gently placed there rather than thrown by the violence of an accident. Bill approached the van cautiously and peered through the open sliding door. The interior was empty. No personal belongings, no luggage, no signs that anyone had ever been inside. The upholstery was clean and undamaged, and there was no trace of the blood he'd seen on the woman's dress. Bill straightened up and looked around the scene again, trying to make sense of what he was experiencing. The van was still there, still lying on its side, across the highway, but everything else, the damage, the blood, the woman in the wedding dress, had simply ceased to exist. He walked back to his truck and tried his CB again. Breaker 19. This is the eastbound truck on Route 50. I've got an abandoned vehicle blocking the roadway at mile marker 73. No signs of occupants or injuries. Requesting state police for vehicle removal. This time, his radio crackled to life. Eastbound truck. This is KDQ 1847. I copy your traffic about the abandoned vehicle. Be advised that state police are en route to your location. ETA, about 20 minutes. Bill waited with his flashers on until the state trooper arrived. The officer was a grizzled veteran who'd obviously seen his share of strange situations on Ohio's back roads. He took Bill's report without comment, made his own inspection of the van, and arranged for a tow truck to remove it from the roadway. Any idea how long it's been here? The trooper asked as they watched the tow truck operator preparing to upright the van. No, sir, Bill replied honestly. I just came over the hill, and there it was. Didn't see anyone around. No signs of recent activity. The trooper nodded and made notes in his report book. Probably kids joyriding, rolled it and walked away. Happens more than you'd think. Good thing you stopped to check it out. Bill didn't mention the woman in the wedding dress. What would he say? That he'd seen a blood-stained bride who'd vanished into thin air. That the van had somehow gone from damaged to pristine while he wasn't looking. Some experiences he'd learned over his years on the road were better kept to yourself. But as Bill continued his trip through the Ohio countryside, he found himself thinking about the woman in the wedding dress. Had she been real? Had he witnessed some kind of supernatural replay of a tragedy that had occurred on this lonely stretch of road? Or had fatigue and isolation played tricks with his perception, creating a scene that existed only in his exhausted mind? Bill never found out the truth about what he'd seen that night on Route 50, but he never forgot the image of the bride, standing beside the overturned van, wearing a dress that should have been the happiest garment of her life, but had instead become a shroud stained with sorrow. Some roads, Bill realized, carry more than just traffic. Some roads carry the echoes of dreams that ended too soon, of promises that couldn't be kept, of love stories that concluded before their time. And sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, those echoes become visible to travelers who happen to be in the right place at the wrong time. The highway, after all, has witnessed every human emotion, joy and sorrow, hope and despair, beginnings and endings, and occasionally it shares those memories with drivers who are willing to stop and bear witness to the stories that refuse to be forgotten. Story 11. The Shoulder Walkers. 15 years of running the Vancouver to San Francisco corridor had taught Marcus that Highway 5 held more mysteries than any road had a right to. The interstate was a lifeline for commerce between Canada and California, carrying everything from lumber and seafood south to electronics and produce north. Marcus had hauled it all in his Conestoga truck, and he thought he'd seen everything the Pacific Coast could offer a professional driver. But the shoulder walkers were something new. Marcus first noticed them about 6 months ago, always during his night runs when traffic was light and the highway belonged mostly to long-haul truckers and the occasional insomniac car driver. They appeared as lone figures walking along the shoulder, always heading in the same direction as traffic, always maintaining a steady pace that seemed unnaturally consistent. The first one had been a woman in a blue dress, walking southbound near Olympia around 2 a.m. Marcus had slowed down, thinking she might be a stranded motorist, but as his headlights illuminated her, she'd turned to look directly at him. Her face had been pale as moonlight, and her eyes had reflected his headlights like an animal's. She'd continued walking without missing a step, never breaking eye contact until his truck had passed. Marcus had tried his CB to report the pedestrian, but other drivers assured him the shoulder was empty. When he checked his mirrors, he could see her for several miles, a blue figure walking steadily south under the interstate lights. But when he called out her position on the radio, no one else could confirm the sighting. The second encounter had been 3 weeks later. This time, an elderly man in what appeared to be hospital scrubs. Same scenario. Walking steadily along the shoulder, turning to watch Marcus's truck pass. Eyes that reflected light in ways human eyes shouldn't. Again, no other drivers could confirm the sighting. And again, the CB radio seemed to carry Marcus's reports into a void of static and skepticism. But it was the third encounter that convinced Marcus he was dealing with something beyond normal highway hazards. Marcus was southbound near Portland, making good time with a load of Canadian lumber for a construction project in the Bay Area. The October night was clear and cold, perfect visibility and light traffic. Marcus had the cruise control set at 65 and was listening to talk radio when his headlights picked up another figure on the shoulder. This time it was an elderly woman wearing what looked like a hospital gown, walking slowly but steadily south. She appeared frail, possibly confused, the kind of person who might have wandered away from a care facility and become lost on the interstate. Marcus immediately pulled over, set his flashers, and climbed down from his cab. "Ma'am," he called out, approaching the figure carefully. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman stopped walking and turned toward him. In the light from his truck's headlights, Marcus could see that she was ancient, probably in her 80s or 90s, with white hair and deeply lined skin, but her eyes were wrong. They were too bright, too aware, and when she looked at Marcus, he felt like she was seeing straight through him to something beyond. "I have to keep walking," she said, in a voice that sounded like wind through dry leaves. "I have to get home." Marcus took a step closer, intending to offer assistance, but the woman raised her hand to stop him. When she did, Marcus saw that her fingers were unnaturally long and thin, more like bare branches than human digits. And when she reached toward him, those finger branches moved with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so frail. "Ma'am, let me help you," Marcus said, but his voice came out as a whisper. Something primitive in his brain was screaming warnings, telling him to get back in his truck and drive away as fast as possible. The woman smiled, and Marcus saw that her teeth were too sharp, too numerous, arranged in rows like a shark's. "I don't need help," she said, and her voice now carried harmonics that made Marcus think of things dying in the woods. "But thank you for stopping. It's been so long since anyone stopped." Marcus backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the woman. She watched him retreat with that terrible smile, her branch fingers swaying slightly in the night breeze. When Marcus reached his truck, he climbed into the cab and locked the doors, his hands shaking as he reached for the ignition. As he pulled away, Marcus checked his mirrors and saw the woman resuming her walk along the shoulder. But now there were others with her. The woman in the blue dress, the man in hospital scrubs, and shapes he couldn't quite make out, but that walked with the same steady, purposeful pace. Marcus had encountered the shoulder walkers dozens of times since then, always on his night runs, always walking south along Highway 5, women in blue dresses, elderly people in hospital gowns, figures in clothing he couldn't quite identify, but that seemed to belong to different time periods. They all shared certain characteristics: the unnatural steadiness of their pace, the way their eyes reflected light, and most disturbing of all, the way they always turned to look directly at his truck as he passed. But something had changed after that encounter with the elderly woman. Now, when the shoulder walkers turned to watch him pass, Marcus could see recognition in their eyes. They knew him now, knew his truck, knew his schedule. They were waiting for him. Marcus started varying his routes, taking I-205 around Portland when possible, even accepting loads that kept him off Highway 5 entirely. But dispatch eventually routed him back to the Vancouver-San Francisco corridor, and the shoulder walkers were always there, walking their endless journey south. The worst part was the certainty that grew in Marcus with each encounter. Someday he was going to stop again, despite every instinct telling him to keep driving. Despite the memories of branch fingers and shark teeth, he knew that eventually he would pull over and offer help to one of those walking figures. And when he did, Marcus wasn't sure he'd be getting back in his truck. Because the shoulder walkers weren't looking for rides. They weren't lost or confused or in need of assistance. They were looking for company, for someone to join their endless walk along the edge of the highway. And they were very, very patient. Marcus still runs the Highway 5 corridor, still hauls freight between Vancouver and San Francisco. But now he drives with his CB volume turned up, his cell phone charged and ready, and his doors locked tight. And when he sees figures walking along the shoulder in his headlights, he doesn't slow down anymore. Some offers of help, Marcus learned, come with prices too high to pay. Some pedestrians on dark highways aren't looking to get somewhere. They're looking for someone to get lost with. The shoulder walkers are still out there, walking steadily south along Highway 5, waiting for the next driver curious enough or compassionate enough to stop. They have all the time in the world, and they know that eventually someone will join them. Someone always does. Story 12. Highway robbery setup. The North Dakota highways were notorious among truckers for their emptiness, especially on runs like this one, where Tommy was hauling agricultural equipment from Fargo to Billings. Miles and miles of prairie stretched in every direction, broken only by the occasional grain elevator or ranch house, glowing like a lighthouse in the vast darkness. It was the kind of landscape that could make a driver feel like the last person on Earth, especially at 2 a.m., when the radio was full of static and the only lights for 50 miles were the ones on your own truck. Tommy had been running this route for Dakota Transport for 7 years, and he'd grown comfortable with the isolation. The money was good. Long-haul runs paid better than local delivery, and the traffic was light enough that a professional driver could make excellent time, without dealing with the constant stress of congested highways. Tonight's load was a combine harvester and associated equipment bound for a John Deere dealership in Montana, time-sensitive freight that had kept Tommy pushing hard since leaving North Dakota that afternoon. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant chatter from other drivers, but mostly Tommy drove through a cocoon of engine noise and classic rock from a radio station in Minneapolis. His fuel was good, his hours of service were legal, and the weather was holding clear and cold. Everything was routine until Tommy's headlights picked up something unusual on the highway ahead. 2 people were lying across the road. They were positioned head-to-toe, spanning both lanes of the 2-lane highway like human speed bumps. Tommy could see them clearly in his headlights. What appeared to be a man and a woman lying motionless on the asphalt about 100 yards ahead. His first instinct was to hit the CB and call for emergency services, while beginning the controlled stop procedure for a 40-ton truck traveling at highway speed. But something made Tommy pause before reaching for his radio. Something about the positioning of the figures struck him as wrong. They were lying too precisely, too symmetrically across the roadway, and in the brief moment when his headlights illuminated them, Tommy thought he saw one of them move. Not the movement of someone injured or unconscious, but the deliberate adjustment of someone who was very much awake and aware. Tommy had heard stories in truck stops and on CB channels about highway robberies, about thieves who used fake accidents or medical emergencies to get drivers to stop in remote locations. The tactic was simple and effective. Position something on the road that looked like an emergency. Wait for a good Samaritan to stop and investigate, then ambush them when they were vulnerable and away from their vehicle. Most drivers dismissed these stories as urban legends, the kind of paranoid fantasies that grew in the isolation of long-haul trucking. But Tommy's uncle had driven truck for 30 years before retiring, and he'd always insisted the stories were true. There's people out there who know truckers are trained to help. His uncle had warned him. They count on your decency to make you vulnerable. Sometimes the best way to help is to keep driving and call for real help. Tommy made his decision in the seconds it took his truck to close the distance to the figures on the road. Instead of stopping, he laid on his air horn. 3 long blasts that echoed across the prairie and moved into the left lane to pass around them. As his truck drew alongside the figures, Tommy saw both of them sit up and look directly at his cab. They weren't injured, they weren't unconscious. They were alert, aware, and clearly surprised that Tommy hadn't stopped. The man was wearing dark clothing and appeared to be young and physically fit. The woman was similarly dressed, and both of them tracked Tommy's truck with their eyes as he passed. In his mirrors, Tommy watched them get to their feet and move quickly off the highway, disappearing into the darkness of the prairie. Tommy grabbed his CB microphone and tried to raise help. Breaker 19. This is westbound on Highway 2, approaching mile marker 89. Got 2 people lying in the roadway. Possible robbery setup. Requesting state police assistance. The response came from a trucker about 20 miles ahead. Copy that. Westbound truck. I'll relay to the authorities. Good thinking, not stopping. Had reports of similar activity in this area over the past month. Tommy's hands were shaking as he continued west toward Montana. The encounter had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it had confirmed his uncle's warnings about the dangers lurking in remote areas where help was far away, and witnesses were non-existent. If he'd stopped to render aid, Tommy would have walked into a trap designed specifically to exploit the better angels of his nature. The state police found Tommy at the next truck stop and took his report. The officer, a veteran of North Dakota's Highway Patrol, wasn't surprised by the account. We've had a series of attempted robberies using this exact method, he explained. 2 or 3 people working together, targeting single drivers on isolated stretches of highway dead. Exactly the right thing by not stopping. The officer went on to explain that the robbery ring had been operating across several states, always using the same tactics: fake accidents, medical emergencies, or stranded motorists to lure drivers into stopping. Once the driver was away from their vehicle, the criminals would rob them and sometimes steal their truck and cargo as well. Several drivers had been seriously injured, and one had died when he tried to resist. The thing that makes this particularly dangerous, the officer said, is that they're targeting the exact quality that makes truckers some of the best people on the road. Their willingness to help strangers in trouble. They're counting on your decency, and they're prepared to hurt you for it. Tommy never encountered the fake accident setup again, but he never forgot the lesson of that night on Highway 2. The road was full of people who genuinely needed help. Broken down motorists, accident victims, travelers who'd made honest mistakes and found themselves in dangerous situations. But there were also predators who understood how to exploit human compassion, who used the appearance of need to create opportunities for violence. The challenge for drivers like Tommy was learning to distinguish between genuine emergencies and manufactured traps, between real victims and skilled predators. It was a balance that required constant vigilance, good judgment, and sometimes the courage to keep driving when every instinct said to stop and help. Because sometimes, Tommy learned that night, the most dangerous thing on a dark highway isn't mechanical failure or weather or wildlife. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is other people who understand exactly how to make evil look like need. Predators who wear the mask of vulnerability to get close enough to strike. The highway, after all, is a reflection of humanity itself, full of genuine kindness and real evil, often impossible to distinguish until it's too late. And the only protection for decent people traveling that highway is the wisdom to recognize that not everyone who appears to need help actually deserves it. Some people lying on dark roads aren't victims waiting for rescue. Some people are hunters waiting for prey. Story 13. The False CB Warning. The Oklahoma Panhandle stretched endlessly in all directions as Jerry worked his way west on I-40, hauling a load of electronics from a distribution center in Arkansas to a computer store chain in New Mexico. The late afternoon sun was beginning to angle low across the prairie, creating those long shadows that could play tricks on a driver's depth perception. Jerry had learned to be extra careful during these sunset hours, when fatigue and changing light conditions could make even routine driving more challenging. Jerry's Peterbilt was running smooth, the Caterpillar engine pulling the grade with the steady power that had made these rigs legendary among professional drivers. His CB radio was tuned to Channel 19, carrying the usual mix of traffic reports, weather updates, and friendly chatter that helped pass the miles on long-haul runs. Jerry didn't participate much in the radio conversations. He was more of a listener than a talker, but he appreciated the sense of community that connected drivers across hundreds of miles of highway. It was just past 6 p.m. when the voice first came through his speakers. Westbound Peterbilt with the reefer trailer, mile marker 47, you've got a blown tire on your trailer. Left side, second axle. Better pull over and check it out before you lose that tire completely. Jerry immediately checked his mirrors and glanced at his tire pressure monitoring system. Everything looked normal. No warning lights, no unusual vibrations, no signs of tire problems. But tire issues could develop quickly, especially on a loaded trailer, and Jerry had enough experience to know that other drivers often spotted problems before the driver himself noticed them. Appreciate the heads up, Jerry replied into his CB microphone. Can you give me your location? I'm not seeing any problems from up here, but I'll find a safe place to pull over and take a look. You're about 2 miles ahead of me, westbound Pete. That tire's looking pretty rough from back here. You might want to get stopped sooner rather than later. Jerry started looking for a wide spot or an exit where he could safely pull over and inspect his equipment. The Oklahoma highway had plenty of shoulders, but Jerry preferred to stop at truck stops or rest areas where he'd have better lighting and more room to maneuver. Safety first. That had been drilled into him during his training years ago, and it had kept him accident-free through 8 years of professional driving. I'm going to take the next exit and check it out at the pilot, Jerry told the unknown driver. Thanks for keeping an eye out. No problem, driver. But you really need to get stopped now. That tire's about to blow, and when it goes, it's going to take out your fender and maybe damage your electrical lines. Pull over anywhere you can find space. Something about the increasing urgency in the voice made Jerry uncomfortable. Professional drivers were usually calm and matter-of-fact when reporting problems. Panic or excessive urgency was often a sign that someone didn't really know what they were talking about. Jerry had been around the industry long enough to distinguish between experienced drivers and pretenders, and this voice was starting to sound less like the former and more like the latter. I'll stop at the next safe location, Jerry replied. Can you describe exactly what you're seeing? Is it the tire itself or the wheel? Just get stopped. The voice came back, more agitated now. You're going to have a blowout any second. There's sparks coming off that wheel. Jerry's discomfort deepened. If there really were sparks coming from his wheel, his onboard monitoring systems would be screaming warnings. His mirrors would show signs of the problem. He would feel vibrations in the steering wheel or hear unusual noises from the trailer. But everything seemed normal. His truck was running as smoothly as it had been all day. Breaker 19, any other drivers in the area of mile marker 50, Jerry called out, looking for confirmation on a possible tire problem on a westbound Peterbilt. Several voices came back immediately. Negative on any problems, westbound Pete. Your equipment looks good from here. No issues visible, driver. Tires look fine, running clean, westbound. Whatever that other driver's seeing, I'm not seeing it. The original voice came back immediately, more insistent than before. You idiots can't see it from where you are. This truck's about to lose a wheel. Driver, you need to pull over right now. Jerry made a decision. Instead of stopping at the next exit, he continued west toward the pilot truck stop he'd mentioned. But now he was paying attention to more than just his equipment. He was watching his mirrors for vehicles that might be following him, checking the CB for any other suspicious transmissions, and generally treating the situation as potentially dangerous rather than merely mechanical. For the next 40 miles, the unknown voice continued pressuring Jerry to stop. The urgency increased with each transmission. The descriptions of the supposed tire problem became more dramatic, and the tone became more demanding. But other drivers on the same stretch of highway continued to report that Jerry's truck looked normal. His equipment appeared to be in good condition, and there were no visible problems with any of his tires. When Jerry finally pulled into the pilot truck stop in Amarillo, he conducted the most thorough equipment inspection of his career. He checked every tire on his rig, examined all the wheels for signs of damage or overheating, tested his braking system, and even crawled under the trailer to look for problems that might not be visible from the outside. Everything was perfect. His tires were properly inflated, showing normal wear patterns and no signs of distress. His wheels were clean and cool to the touch. His braking system was functioning normally. There was absolutely no evidence of the catastrophic tire failure that the CB voice had been warning him about for nearly an hour. Jerry was filling out his logbook when another driver approached him in the truck stop parking lot. The man was a veteran trucker, probably in his 50s, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades on America's highways. You the Pete that some character was trying to get stopped back on I-40? The other driver asked. Yeah, that was me, Jerry replied. Did you hear all that? The older driver nodded grimly. Heard the whole thing. That wasn't a legitimate driver trying to help you out. That was someone trying to get you stopped in a vulnerable position, probably so they could rob you or steal your load. Been happening more often lately. Criminals using CB radios to create fake emergencies. The veteran driver went on to explain that organized theft rings had begun using CB radios to target isolated trucks, creating false mechanical emergencies or safety concerns to get drivers to stop in remote locations. Once the driver was away from his vehicle and focused on the supposed problem, accomplices would approach from multiple directions to overwhelm and rob the victim. The thing that gives them away, the older driver explained, is that they never know when to stop. A real driver would spot a problem, report it, and then move on. These criminals keep pushing because they need you stopped, and they'll say anything to make that happen. Jerry reported the incident to both the truck stop management and local law enforcement. The state police were familiar with the CB harassment tactic and assured Jerry that he'd handled the situation correctly by not stopping until he reached a safe, well-lit location with other people around. But the experience changed how Jerry approached CB communications. He became more skeptical of unsolicited warnings, more careful about when and where he stopped for equipment checks, and more aware of the ways that criminals could exploit the cooperative culture of professional trucking. The CB radio was one of trucking's greatest safety tools, connecting drivers across hundreds of miles and providing real-time information about road conditions, weather, and mechanical problems. But like any tool, it could be misused by people with bad intentions, turned from a device that protected drivers into a weapon that put them in danger. Jerry continued using his CB radio, continued participating in the network of mutual assistance that made trucking safer for everyone. But he never forgot the lesson of that afternoon in Oklahoma. Not every voice on the radio was trying to help. Not every warning was legitimate. And sometimes the most dangerous thing a driver could do was trust a stranger who claimed to be looking out for his safety. Because predators understand that truckers are trained to help each other, trained to respond when someone reports a problem or asks for assistance. And sometimes those predators use that training against the very people it was meant to protect. The highway, after all, is full of voices, some offering genuine help, others offering carefully disguised harm. And the only way to tell the difference is to listen, not just to what they're saying, but to how they're saying it, and to trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right. Some warnings, Jerry learned that day, are more dangerous than the problems they claim to identify. Story 14. Sam's Club DC Delivery Horror. The GPS directions seemed straightforward enough when Carl left the Sam's Club distribution center with his delivery confirmation. Take Highway 78 east for 12 miles. Then follow the winding 2-lane road for another 8 miles to reach the rural store location. Carl had been making deliveries for Cisco for 6 years, and rural runs were nothing new. Small towns and remote locations were often the most challenging deliveries, but they usually offered a welcome break from the congested loading docks and aggressive traffic of urban distribution centers. This particular run was taking him deep into East Texas pine country, the kind of landscape where civilization thinned out to scattered farms and hunting camps, connected by narrow roads that had probably started as logging trails decades earlier. Carl's truck was loaded with restaurant supplies and frozen foods for a small-town Sam's Club. Time-sensitive freight that needed to be delivered before the store's morning opening. The sun had set an hour ago, and Carl was navigating by the glow of his headlights and the occasional reflector marking curves and intersections. The two-lane road wound through dense forest, climbing and descending hills that blocked his view of what lay ahead. Carl kept his speed conservative. These rural roads could be deceptive, with sharp curves that appeared suddenly and wildlife that wandered into traffic without warning. Carl was checking his GPS and confirming his route when his headlights picked up a figure walking toward him in the opposite lane. But as the figure got closer, illuminated more clearly by Carl's approaching headlights, details became visible that made Carl's grip tighten on the steering wheel. The person appeared to be a young man, maybe in his 20s, walking directly down the center of the road with an unsteady, lurching gait. His face was visible in the headlight beams, but it was wrong in ways that Carl's mind struggled to process. The features seemed distorted, swollen, with skin that had an unnatural pallor. But most disturbing were the man's eyes, wide and staring, reflecting Carl's headlights with an intensity that seemed almost luminescent. Carl realized he was looking at someone who was huffing paint or some other inhalant, someone whose brain chemistry had been altered by chemicals that weren't meant for human consumption. Carl had encountered paint huffers before in urban areas, homeless people and addicts who used spray paint, gasoline, or other solvents to get high, often with devastating effects on their health and behavior. But this was rural East Texas, miles from any city or even substantial town. What was a paint huffer doing walking down a remote forest road in the middle of the night? The man continued walking toward Carl's truck, showing no awareness of the danger posed by 40 tons of rolling steel. Carl hit his air horn, 3 sharp blasts that should have alerted anyone with functioning hearing. But the figure didn't react, didn't step aside, didn't even seem to notice the approaching truck. Carl was forced to swerve into the other lane to avoid hitting the man, his trailer swaying slightly as he corrected back into his lane. In his mirrors, Carl watched the figure continue walking down the center of the road, still maintaining that lurching, unsteady pace, completely oblivious to the truck that had just passed him. Carl reached for his CB radio to warn other drivers, but realized that he hadn't heard any CB chatter for the past hour. These rural roads didn't carry much truck traffic, especially at night, and the mountainous terrain probably limited radio coverage anyway. Carl tried his cell phone, thinking he should report the dangerous pedestrian to local law enforcement, but found no signal bars in this remote area. Carl continued toward his delivery, but the encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. There had been something deeply wrong about the figure on the road. Not just the obvious effects of chemical intoxication, but something more fundamentally disturbing. The man's face had looked like it was melting, like the bone structure underneath was dissolving and reforming, and those eyes. Carl had seen a lot of addicts over the years, but he'd never seen eyes that reflected light like an animal's. The delivery went smoothly. The Sam's Club loading dock was well lit and professional. The receiving clerks were efficient and friendly, and Carl's paperwork was processed without problems. But as he prepared to leave the store and return to the main highway, Carl found himself dreading the drive back through those dark woods. Carl took a different route back to the interstate, adding 20 miles to his trip, but avoiding the narrow forest road where he'd encountered the paint huffer. The longer route took him through small towns with streetlights and traffic, past gas stations and convenience stores that were still open. It felt safer, more connected to normal human civilization. But Carl never forgot that face in his headlights, the distorted features, the reflecting eyes, the complete lack of awareness or self-preservation instinct. He'd heard stories about what chronic inhalant abuse could do to a person's brain, how it could cause permanent damage to judgment, coordination, and basic survival reflexes. But he'd never seen the effects so dramatically displayed, and certainly not in such an isolated and dangerous location. Carl reported the incident when he got back to his terminal, both for safety reasons and to warn other drivers who might be making rural deliveries in the same area. The dispatcher took note of the location and promised to include warnings in future route instructions. But there wasn't much that could be done beyond alerting drivers to exercise extra caution on remote roads where help might be far away. The encounter changed how Carl approached rural deliveries. He became more aware of the isolation, more careful about his route planning, and more conscious of the fact that emergency services might be hours away if something went wrong. He also carried more emergency supplies, extra food, water, blankets, and first aid equipment, in case he found himself stranded in a remote area. But mostly, Carl never forgot the lesson of that night in the East Texas woods. The highway could be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with mechanical failures or weather conditions. Sometimes the danger came from human beings whose choices had taken them so far from normal behavior that they became hazards to themselves and others. The paint huffer walking down that dark road had been someone's son, someone's brother, maybe someone's father. But chemical abuse had transformed him into something that barely resembled a functioning human being, a lost soul wandering dark roads without awareness or purpose. Carl still makes rural deliveries, still navigates the narrow roads that connect America's small towns to the larger economy, but he drives more carefully now, more aware that the next curve might reveal something that challenges his understanding of what it means to be human. Some roads, Carl learned that night, lead to places where people go to lose themselves, and sometimes those people never find their way back. Story 15. The Lot Lizard Encounter. The Dallas truck stop was typical of the larger facilities that dotted the interstate system. Dozens of fuel pumps, a convenience store the size of a small supermarket, shower facilities, a driver's lounge, and a restaurant that stayed open 24 hours to serve the endless flow of professional drivers. Mike had been stopping here for years during his runs between Houston and Oklahoma City, and he knew the layout, the staff, and the general rhythm of the place. It was just past 1 a.m. when Mike pulled his Freightliner into a parking spot near the back of the lot, away from the main building and the bright lights of the fuel island. He'd been driving for 11 hours and needed to take his mandatory 10-hour break before continuing north with his load of chemical products. The truck stop was busy, despite the late hour. The parking lot was nearly full of rigs from carriers across the country, their running lights creating a constellation of red and amber dots in the darkness. Mike completed his post-trip inspection, updated his logbook, and settled into his sleeper berth for the night. The truck stop provided white noise from diesel engines, generator sets, and the occasional air brake release, sounds that had become as familiar as a lullaby during his 8 years of long-haul driving. Mike was just drifting off to sleep when the knocking started. It wasn't unusual for drivers to be approached at truck stops. other drivers looking for directions, truck stop employees checking on problems, even law enforcement conducting routine inspections. But this knocking was different. It was insistent, rhythmic, and accompanied by a voice that immediately put Mike on alert. "Hey honey, you awake in there? Got some company for you, if you're interested." Mike sighed and rubbed his eyes. He was dealing with a lot lizard, truck stop slang for prostitutes who worked the parking lots, targeting drivers who might be lonely, isolated, or simply looking for companionship during their mandatory rest periods. It was an old problem in the trucking industry, one that created legal, health, and safety risks for everyone involved. Mike had encountered lot lizards before, and he'd learned that the best approach was to be polite but firm in declining their services. Most moved on quickly when it became clear that a driver wasn't interested. But the knocking continued, now accompanied by more aggressive attempts to get his attention. "Come on, baby. I know you're in there. Just want to talk. Maybe keep you company for a while. I'm real friendly." Mike cracked his sleeper curtain and looked toward his passenger door. In the dim light from the truck stop's security lamps, he could see a woman standing beside his truck. She appeared to be in her 60s, thin to the point of being gaunt, with stringy gray hair and clothes that had seen better days. Most disturbing was her smile, a gap-toothed grin that revealed maybe 3 teeth in her entire mouth. The woman was wearing a tank top despite the cool October night, and Mike could see that she wasn't wearing a bra. Her raspy voice suggested years of heavy smoking, and her posture indicated someone who'd lived a hard life on the margins of society. She continued knocking on his door and calling out suggestions that became increasingly explicit and desperate. Mike reached for his CB radio, thinking he might need to call for security or even law enforcement if the woman became more aggressive. Truck stops usually had security patrols specifically to deal with situations like this, but the larger facilities could be challenging to monitor comprehensively, especially during overnight hours when staffing was reduced. "Hey there," Mike called through his door, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested. I need to get some sleep before my next driving shift." The woman's demeanor changed immediately. The fake friendliness disappeared, replaced by anger and frustration. "Don't be such a prissy boy. I ain't asking for much. Just a little business to help a lady out. You truckers are all the same. Want to act like you're too good for working girls." Mike decided not to engage further. He closed his curtain, turned off his reading light, and tried to ignore the continued knocking and increasingly profane suggestions coming from outside his truck. Experience had taught him that lot lizards usually moved on to other potential customers. When it became clear that a particular driver wasn't going to participate, but this woman was persistent. For nearly an hour, she continued her attempts to get Mike's attention, knocking on different parts of his truck, calling out to him, even climbing onto his running boards to peer through his windows. Mike found himself unable to sleep, concerned that the situation might escalate to property damage or more serious problems. Finally, Mike saw security lights approaching in his mirrors, a truck stop security guard making his rounds in a golf cart. Mike climbed out of his sleeper and flagged down the guard, explaining the situation and pointing out the woman who was now trying to engage other drivers in the parking area. The security guard, a retired police officer who'd seen every variation of truck stop drama during his years on the job, handled the situation with professional efficiency. He approached the woman calmly, explained that she needed to leave the property, and escorted her toward the truck stop's exit. No drama, no confrontation, just the quiet resolution of a problem that interfered with the truck stop's primary mission of serving professional drivers. "Sorry about that," the guard told Mike as they watched the woman disappear into the darkness beyond the truck stop's lighting. "We try to keep the lot clear, but sometimes they slip through. These folks are usually just trying to survive, but they don't understand that they're creating problems for drivers who are just trying to do their jobs." Mike thanked the guard and returned to his sleeper, finally able to get the rest he needed before continuing his run to Oklahoma City. But the encounter had reminded him of one of the less pleasant aspects of truck stop culture: the presence of people who lived on the margins, who saw the constant flow of drivers as potential customers for services that ranged from questionable to illegal. The trucking industry had made significant efforts to address the lot lizard problem over the years, working with law enforcement, truck stop management, and driver education programs to reduce the incidents and protect both drivers and the women involved. But it remained an issue at some locations, particularly larger truck stops near major cities where prostitution was already a problem. Mike had been propositioned dozens of times during his years on the road, and he'd learned to handle such situations with a combination of firmness and compassion. Many of the women involved were victims themselves of addiction, abuse, economic desperation, or human trafficking. They deserved help, but not the kind of help that truck drivers were qualified or legally able to provide. The encounter in Dallas reminded Mike why he preferred smaller, family-owned truck stops when possible. The larger corporate facilities offered more amenities and services, but they also attracted problems that made life more complicated for professional drivers who just wanted to fuel their trucks, grab a meal, and get some rest between driving shifts. Because truck stops, Mike realized, were more than just business facilities. They were crossroads where America's highways intersected with all of humanity's struggles: economic, social, personal, and legal. And sometimes those intersections created situations that tested a driver's judgment, compassion, and professional responsibilities. Some encounters on the road, Mike learned that night, required saying no with kindness, walking away with dignity, and remembering that everyone's got a story, even if it's not a story you want to be part of. Story 16, The Truck Stop Stalker. The rural gas station looked innocent enough in the late afternoon sunlight. A small, independent operation with 4 pumps, a convenience store, and enough space for trucks to maneuver around the diesel island. Sarah and Mark had been driving cross-country for 3 days, taking turns behind the wheel of their Honda Civic and making good time on their move from California to Florida. The little station offered a chance to fuel up, grab some snacks, and stretch their legs before the final push to their overnight stop. Sarah was filling the tank while Mark went inside to pay and buy drinks. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine forests and farmland that surrounded the station. Traffic was light on the rural highway, mostly local vehicles, and the occasional truck making deliveries to small towns scattered throughout the region. Sarah was just finishing with the fuel pump when she noticed the truck parked on the far side of the station. It was a long-haul rig, a Peterbilt tractor pulling a dry van trailer, with out-of-state plates and the kind of road grime that suggested it had been traveling for days. Nothing unusual about that. Truck drivers often stopped at small stations for fuel and food, especially on routes that avoided the larger truck stops. But something about the driver made Sarah uncomfortable. He was standing beside his truck, apparently conducting a routine inspection, but his attention seemed focused on Sarah rather than his equipment. He was a large man, probably in his 40s, with a full beard and the kind of intense stare that made Sarah feel like she was being evaluated rather than simply observed. When Mark came out of the convenience store, the truck driver approached them with what appeared to be casual friendliness. "Y'all traveling far?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight accent that Sarah couldn't place. "Just passing through," Mark replied politely. Professional drivers were generally friendly people, and Mark saw no reason to be rude to someone who was probably just making conversation. "Long way from home, I bet," the driver continued, his eyes focusing on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Pretty girl like that probably doesn't get to see much of the country. This is beautiful territory through here. Lots of places a person could disappear for a while. You know what I mean?" Sarah felt alarm bells going off in her head. The driver's words weren't overtly threatening, but there was something about his tone and body language that suggested meanings beyond the surface conversation. She moved closer to Mark and tried to signal that they needed to leave. "We should get going," Sarah said quietly. "We've got a long way to drive before dark." But the truck driver continued talking, asking questions about their route, their destination, how long they'd been traveling. His questions seemed designed to gather information rather than simply make conversation, and his attention remained focused primarily on Sarah, despite Mark's attempts to engage him. "You folks wouldn't be interested in some company, would you?" the driver asked, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I'm headed in the same direction, and these roads can be dangerous for people who don't know them. Lot of places where a car could break down and not be found for days." Sarah grabbed Mark's arm. "We need to go now," she whispered urgently. Mark picked up on Sarah's distress and began moving toward their car. "Thanks for the offer, but we're fine on our own. Safe travels." The truck driver followed them to their car, continuing to talk about the dangers of traveling alone, the benefits of having an experienced driver to follow, and his willingness to provide protection for travelers who might need help. His persistence and the underlying menace in his tone made it clear that this wasn't just friendly conversation. Sarah and Mark got into their car and locked the doors immediately. As Mark started the engine, the truck driver approached the driver's side window and knocked gently. "Y'all sure you don't want some company? It gets lonely out here, and a pretty girl like that could use someone to keep her safe." Mark put the car in gear and pulled away from the gas pumps, but the truck driver continued talking through the closed window, his voice becoming more insistent. "I'll be on the road behind you anyway. Same direction, same route. Might as well travel together." As they pulled onto the highway, Sarah looked back and saw the truck driver standing beside his rig, watching their departure with the same intense stare. Something about his posture and expression reminded her of nature documentaries she'd seen about predators studying potential prey. "We need to call the police," Sarah said, her hands shaking as she reached for her cell phone. "And tell them what?" Mark replied, "that a truck driver was overly friendly, that he made us uncomfortable. He didn't actually threaten us or break any laws." Sarah knew Mark was right, but the encounter had left her deeply shaken. There had been something predatory about the truck driver's behavior, something that suggested he was experienced in approaching isolated travelers and using his size and knowledge of remote roads to intimidate potential victims. For the next 100 miles, Sarah found herself checking the mirrors constantly, looking for the distinctive Peterbilt that had been parked at the gas station. Every truck they passed became a potential threat, every rest stop a possible trap. The encounter had transformed what should have been a routine cross-country drive into a journey filled with anxiety and fear. They never saw the truck driver again, but Sarah never forgot the lesson of that afternoon at the rural gas station. The highway was full of helpful, friendly people who genuinely wanted to assist travelers in need, but it was also frequented by predators who understood how to use the appearance of helpfulness to get close to potential victims. The truck driver's questions hadn't been random conversation, they'd been intelligence gathering. His offers of assistance hadn't been genuine. They'd been attempts to gain control over their movements and decisions. His references to dangerous roads and isolated areas hadn't been warnings. They'd been threats disguised as helpful advice. Sarah and Mark completed their cross-country move without further incident. But the experience changed how they approached interactions with strangers during their travels. They became more cautious about sharing information, more selective about where they stopped for fuel and food, and more aware of the ways that predators could use the openness and trust that characterized most highway interactions. Because the road, Sarah learned, that day attracted all kinds of people, including those who saw other travelers not as fellow human beings, but as opportunities. And sometimes the most dangerous predators were the ones who looked most normal, who spoke most pleasantly, and who offered help that came with prices too high to pay. The highway, after all, was a reflection of society itself. Mostly good people trying to get somewhere, but occasionally harboring those who saw other people's journeys as chances to inflict harm. And the only protection for decent travelers was the wisdom to recognize when friendliness crossed the line into predation, when offers of help became attempts at control. Some conversations at gas stations, Sarah realized, weren't conversations at all. They were interviews conducted by hunters who specialized in finding prey that looked easy to catch. Story 17. The Midnight Knockers. The Pennsylvania Rest Area was one of those older facilities that predated the modern truck stop chains. A simple parking area with basic restrooms and picnic tables, situated on a scenic overlook that provided views of the surrounding mountains during daylight hours. At 2 a.m., though, the scenic views were invisible, and the rest area served mainly as a place for drivers to take their mandatory breaks away from the stress and danger of highway driving. Tony had been running freight for 12 years, and he'd learned to appreciate these quiet, overnight stops. Unlike the larger truck stops with their bright lights, constant noise, and commercial activity, places like this offered the peace and quiet that made it possible to actually get some rest during the mandatory 10-hour break periods. Tonight, Tony was sharing the parking area with 2 other trucks, a flatbed hauler from Texas and a refrigerated unit from Michigan. The 3 trucks were parked in a rough line, maintaining the informal spacing that allowed each driver privacy while providing the security that came from numbers. Professional drivers looked out for each other, especially during overnight stops in remote locations where help might be far away if problems developed. Tony had completed his post-trip inspection, updated his logbook, and settled into his sleeper berth for the night. The October air was cool enough that he'd closed his windows and turned on his truck's auxiliary power unit for heat. Outside, the only sounds were the gentle hum of diesel engines and the occasional call of night birds in the surrounding forest. Tony was just drifting off to sleep when the knocking started. It began as a soft tapping on the passenger side of his truck, so quiet that at first Tony thought it might be a tree branch blown by the wind. But the tapping quickly became more insistent, developing into a rhythmic knocking that was clearly deliberate. Someone was outside his truck, demanding attention. Tony's first thought was that one of the other drivers needed help. Maybe a mechanical problem, maybe a medical emergency, maybe just someone who'd locked their keys in their cab. But when Tony looked out his sleeper window, he couldn't see anyone in the parking area. The other two trucks sat silent and dark, their drivers apparently sleeping peacefully. The knocking continued, now coming from multiple locations around Tony's truck. First the passenger door, then the sleeper walls, then what sounded like the front bumper area. The sounds were loud enough to shake the entire truck, as if someone were pounding on the aluminum surfaces with considerable force. Tony grabbed his flashlight and climbed into the driver's seat, intending to look outside and identify the source of the disturbance. But when he peered out the windows, scanning the entire parking area with his flashlight beam, he saw nothing. No people, no animals, no objects that could be causing the noise. The knocking stopped as soon as Tony turned on his flashlight, creating an eerie silence that was somehow more disturbing than the noise had been. Tony waited for several minutes, listening carefully, but heard only the normal sounds of truck engines and forest wildlife. Just as Tony was about to return to his sleeper, the knocking resumed with increased intensity. Now it sounded like multiple people pounding on his truck from all sides simultaneously. Passenger door, driver door, sleeper walls, trailer surfaces. The entire rig was shaking from the force of the impacts, and Tony could hear what sounded like fists or tools striking the metal surfaces. Tony immediately reached for his CB radio. Breaker 19. Any drivers at the rest area, mile marker 67 eastbound. Got some kind of disturbance out here, looking for assistance. The response came from one of the other trucks in the parking area. Copy that, middle truck. This is the flatbed on the end. We're hearing it too. Both trucks are getting the same treatment. Sounds like someone's trying to break in. Roger that, flatbed. This is the reefer unit. Same thing happening here. Somebody's raising hell with all three trucks at the same time. Tony felt a mixture of relief and increased alarm. Relief that he wasn't experiencing some kind of hallucination or mechanical problem, but alarm that whatever was causing the disturbance was affecting all three trucks simultaneously. That suggested either multiple people working in coordination or something else that didn't want to think about too carefully. The three drivers coordinated their response over the CB radio. Let's all turn on our exterior lights at the same time, suggested the flatbed driver. Maybe we can see what's out there. Copy that. On my count, 3, 2, 1, lights on. All three trucks illuminated their exterior lighting simultaneously, flooding the parking area with bright white light from headlights, marker lights, and work lamps. Tony scanned the area carefully, looking for any sign of the source of the disturbance. Nothing. The parking area was completely empty except for the three trucks. No people, no vehicles, no animals. Nothing that could account for the violent knocking that had been shaking all three rigs just moments before. Anybody see anything? Asked the reefer driver. Negative, Tony replied. Empty lot. But that knocking was definitely real. My whole truck was shaking. Same here, confirmed the flatbed driver. Something was definitely out there, but whatever it was, it's gone now. The three drivers agreed to keep their exterior lights on and maintain radio contact throughout the remainder of the night. They also decided to cut their rest periods short and get back on the road as soon as legally possible. None of them felt comfortable staying in a location where they'd experienced such an unexplained and potentially threatening situation. The knocking didn't resume, but Tony didn't sleep either. He spent the remaining hours until dawn listening for unusual sounds and checking his mirrors for signs of movement in the parking area. When 6 a.m. arrived and he was legally allowed to resume driving, Tony was more than ready to get back on the highway. The three drivers met at a truck stop 20 miles down the road for breakfast and to compare notes about their experience. All three had been affected simultaneously. All three had heard the same types of sounds, and all three had seen nothing when they investigated. None of them had a rational explanation for what had occurred. "Been driving for 22 years, the flatbed driver said over coffee, "and I've never experienced anything like that. Sounded like a dozen people pounding on my truck with hammers, but there was nobody there. Could have been kids," suggested the reefer driver. "Maybe local teenagers playing pranks on truckers." "Kids would have been visible when we turned on the lights," Tony pointed out, "and they would have made noise running away. Whatever that was, it stopped the instant we lit up the area." The three drivers never found an explanation for what they'd experienced that night at the Pennsylvania rest area. They reported the incident to state police, but without evidence of damage or ongoing danger, there wasn't much law enforcement could do beyond increasing patrols in the area. Tony never stopped at that particular rest area again, and he noticed that other drivers seemed to avoid it as well. Word traveled quickly through the trucking community about locations where strange or dangerous incidents occurred, and drivers adjusted their routes accordingly. But Tony never forgot the lesson of that night in Pennsylvania. The road held mysteries that couldn't be explained by mechanical problems, weather conditions, or normal human behavior. Sometimes the darkness concealed forces that operated by rules different from the ones that governed everyday reality. The midnight knockers, whatever they were, had been real enough to shake three trucks simultaneously, coordinated enough to affect multiple targets at once, and elusive enough to vanish the moment light was applied to the situation. They represented something beyond Tony's understanding of how the world worked, something that challenged his assumptions about what was possible on America's highways. Some rest areas, Tony learned that night, didn't offer rest at all. Some stops on the road were inhabited by things that didn't want travelers to sleep, that preferred to keep people awake and afraid and eager to move on to somewhere else. And sometimes, the best thing a driver could do was exactly that. Pack up and move on, leaving the mysteries unsolved and the questions unanswered, content to reach the next destination without understanding everything that happened along the way. Story 18. The Highway Encounter with the Unknown. I've been driving trucks for over 10 years now, and in that time, I've witnessed things that most people would dismiss as impossible. The highways hold secrets that only those of us who spend our nights traveling the lonely stretches of asphalt ever truly understand. Of all the strange encounters I've experienced, one stands out above all others. A night that changed my perspective on what exists beyond our ordinary world. It happened during my early days as a trucker, perhaps 6 months into my career. I was transporting a valuable statue from North Carolina to Tennessee for a private collector, a routine delivery that should have been straightforward and uneventful. The summer evening was warm, and I had been making good time along the interstate. as darkness began to settle over the landscape. The radio played softly in the background, and I felt relaxed and confident about reaching my destination on schedule. Everything changed the moment I crossed the Tennessee state line. Without warning, my truck simply died. There was no sputtering, no gradual loss of power, no mechanical sounds that might indicate engine trouble. The radio fell silent. All the dashboard needles dropped to zero simultaneously, and the steering wheel locked completely. I found myself coasting to a stop in the middle of the freeway, unable to guide the massive vehicle toward the shoulder despite my desperate attempts to regain control. After securing emergency cones around my truck to protect other drivers, I attempted to call for help. My phone displayed no service bars, showing only a roaming message that offered no hope of connection. My mobile internet hotspot, usually reliable even in remote areas, refused to establish any kind of connection. I was completely cut off from the outside world, stranded in the darkness with no way to contact anyone. Minutes passed as I stood behind my truck, hoping to flag down a passing motorist who might assist me or at least relay a message to authorities. The isolation of the highway became increasingly apparent as no other vehicles appeared. When I checked my phone again, expecting to see time progressing normally, I discovered something that filled me with confusion and growing unease. According to my device, no time had passed at all since my truck had stopped functioning. A strange sensation crept over me, the unmistakable feeling that I was being observed by unseen eyes. I scanned the dark fields stretching endlessly on both sides of the highway, seeing nothing but shadows and empty farmland. Then I heard it, a low mechanical humming that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. The sound grew steadily louder, but it wasn't coming from the road ahead or behind me. The source was directly above. Reluctantly, I raised my eyes toward the night sky and witnessed something that defied all rational explanation. A large craft hovered silently overhead, its surface appearing to be constructed of gray and silver materials that reflected the faint starlight. Lights arranged around its circumference pulsed in a rhythmic pattern, while a brilliant central beam illuminated the ground around my truck like an enormous spotlight. The craft was clearly artificial, clearly controlled by some intelligence, and clearly not of human origin. My heart raced as I stared upward at this impossible sight. The mechanical humming intensified, and the bright light from the craft grew more intense until it completely enveloped my vision in pure white radiance. I felt my consciousness slipping away as my legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed onto the cold asphalt, my last coherent thought being a prayer that I would survive whatever was happening to me. When awareness returned, I found myself lying on the ground with a concerned woman kneeling beside me. She had placed her jacket under my head as a pillow and was speaking in soothing tones, telling me not to move and assuring me that an ambulance was already on its way. Emergency responders arrived quickly, and before I fully understood what was happening, I was being transported to a nearby hospital for medical evaluation. The medical staff asked about the circumstances that led to my collapse, and I knew instinctively that describing my encounter with the strange craft would only result in skepticism and possibly psychiatric evaluation. Instead, I explained that my truck had experienced mechanical failure, and when I exited to investigate, I must have suffered from dizziness and lost consciousness. The doctors accepted this explanation without question, conducted their examinations, and ultimately released me with a clean bill of health. The following morning brought another surprise. My truck, which had been completely dead the previous evening, started immediately and ran perfectly. The company I worked for had arranged for another driver to complete the delivery, and we agreed to split the payment fairly, despite the mysteries surrounding that night. I considered myself fortunate to have emerged from the experience unharmed, and with my livelihood intact. Even now, years later, I cannot explain what occurred on that lonely stretch of Tennessee highway. The craft I witnessed was unlike anything in our current technology, and the temporary suspension of time remains a puzzle that haunts my thoughts. I've continued my trucking career, always watching the skies during my nighttime drives, but I've never again encountered anything similar to that mysterious gray and silver visitor from above. Story 19. The Rest Stop Apparition. 3 years after my encounter on the Tennessee highway, I experienced another supernatural event that reinforced my belief that truck drivers witness things that exist beyond the boundaries of normal reality. This incident took place at one of the countless rest stops that dot our nation's highways, places that have earned a reputation for being less than pleasant, but serve as necessary waypoints for travelers who spend long hours on the road. Rest stops have always been problematic locations, gathering places for various unsavory characters, and often poorly maintained by overworked staff. I've never visited one that didn't feature some combination of unpleasant odors, questionable stains, and evidence of activities that decent people prefer not to contemplate. However, the rest stop in this particular story contained something far more disturbing than the usual collection of human-created unpleasantness. I pulled into the facility during the late evening hours, when most travelers avoid stopping unless absolutely necessary. The parking area was nearly empty, with only a few cars scattered among the designated spaces. The building itself looked typical for such establishments, constructed with basic materials and designed for utility rather than comfort or aesthetic appeal. I approached the entrance with my usual strategy of holding my breath to minimize exposure to whatever odors awaited inside. The men's restroom was exactly what I expected, featuring the standard collection of broken fixtures, poor lighting, and surfaces that hadn't seen proper cleaning in far too long. I quickly made my way to one of the urinals, planning to complete my business and escape as rapidly as possible. The sooner I could return to my truck and continue my journey, the better I would feel about the entire stop. After finishing at the urinal, I moved to the sink area to wash my hands thoroughly, a practice I've learned is essential when using public facilities of questionable cleanliness. As I looked up into the grimy mirror above the sink, I noticed something that immediately struck me as odd. Another person was standing at the same urinal I had just vacated, despite the fact that I had been the only occupant of the restroom when I entered, and I had neither seen nor heard anyone come in behind me. The figure appeared to be a man, but his appearance was distinctly unsettling. His clothes were dirty and disheveled, suggesting he might be a hitchhiker or someone who had been living rough on the road. My first instinct was to prepare a polite excuse for why I couldn't offer him a ride. As I've learned to be cautious about picking up strangers, regardless of their apparent circumstances, something about his overall demeanor suggested he might not have entirely innocent intentions. I finished washing my hands and turned toward the paper towel dispenser located near the restroom's exit door. When I glanced back toward the urinal area, the mysterious figure had completely vanished. I searched the entire facility, checking under stall doors and looking in every corner where someone might potentially hide, but found no trace of the person I had clearly seen in the mirror just moments before. The layout of the restroom made his disappearance even more puzzling. There was only one entrance, positioned directly beside the paper towel dispenser where I had been standing. Anyone attempting to leave would have had to pass directly in front of me, making it impossible for the figure to exit without being observed. The windows were too small and too high for a person to climb through, and there were no other potential escape routes. As I turned back toward the door to make my own exit, I received the shock of my lifetime. The same man I had seen in the mirror was now standing directly in front of me, but his appearance had transformed dramatically. His face was battered and bloodied. His clothing was soaked with what appeared to be mud and darker substances, and his entire presence radiated an aura of violence and tragedy that made my blood run cold. My startled reaction caused me to jump backward involuntarily, and in my panic, I stepped into a puddle of some unidentifiable liquid that had collected on the floor. I lost my footing immediately and crashed to the ground, instinctively putting out my hands to break my fall. My palms made contact with another pool of mystery fluid, and I spent several anxious seconds examining my hands to ensure I hadn't touched anything truly dangerous or disgusting. When I looked up again, expecting to see the ghostly figure looming over me, I found that he had vanished once more. The restroom was completely empty, except for myself, and an eerie silence had settled over the entire building. I climbed to my feet carefully, brushed myself off as best I could, and made a hasty retreat toward the exit door. The heavy metal door had an old, rusty hinge that produced an unmistakable squeaking sound audible from a considerable distance. If the mysterious figure had attempted to leave through that door, I would certainly have heard the distinctive noise. His ability to appear and disappear without using the obvious exit suggested that I had encountered something beyond normal human explanation, possibly the spirit of someone who had met a violent end in that location. I've never forgotten that encounter, and I avoid that particular rest stop whenever possible during my travels. The memory of that battered, bloodied face continues to haunt my dreams, and I often wonder about the story behind the apparition and what terrible events might have occurred there to create such a restless spirit. Story 20. The Persistent Highway Stalker. When I was 18 years old and experiencing my first taste of independence as a college student, I learned a valuable lesson about the dangers that can face young women traveling alone on America's highways. I was driving from my out-of-state college back to my hometown for my brother's wedding, a journey I had made several times without incident. The trip typically took about 4 hours, and I was looking forward to the family celebration and a break from my academic responsibilities. The day started perfectly, with clear skies and moderate traffic that made for pleasant driving conditions. I was traveling along Interstate 40 in Tennessee, listening to music and enjoying the scenery, when I first noticed the truck driver who would turn my routine trip into a terrifying ordeal. He was driving a large semi-truck in the lane adjacent to mine, positioned slightly behind my car so that I could see his headlights in my passenger side mirror. Despite the bright afternoon sunshine, the truck driver began flashing his headlights at me repeatedly. My initial reaction was to assume he was trying to alert me to some kind of traffic situation, or perhaps suggesting that I move into a different lane. I attempted to comply with what I thought might be his request, changing lanes to give him more space, but he continued following me and flashing his lights with increasing frequency. When I looked up at the truck's cab, I could see the driver waving at me and occasionally honking his horn. At first, I interpreted these actions as potentially helpful warnings about my vehicle. The previous week, I had experienced a tire puncture and had it repaired with a patch. So, I worried that the patch might have failed and my tire was losing air as I traveled at highway speeds. The thought of having a blowout at 60 miles per hour was terrifying enough to make me consider pulling over to investigate. Fortunately, an exit appeared ahead with a gas station that had several customers visible from the road. The presence of other people made the location feel safe, so I decided to stop and examine my car. To my growing unease, the truck driver followed me off the highway and into the same parking lot, choosing a spot in the designated truck parking area while I pulled up to a gas pump. I quickly walked around my car, checking each tire carefully, and was relieved to discover that they all appeared to be properly inflated and in good condition. However, my relief was short-lived as I noticed the truck driver climbing down from his cab and walking in my direction. Something about his demeanor and the way he had been following me made me increasingly uncomfortable, so I decided to buy some gas as a pretext for staying near other customers and avoiding being alone with him. As I inserted my credit card into the gas pump, the truck driver approached my car and positioned himself a few feet away from the rear bumper. The gas hose created a physical barrier between us, but I could see him clearly and hear his voice when he spoke. Having anticipated the possibility of trouble, I had already dialed 911 on my phone and only needed to press the call button to summon help if the situation escalated. I kept my driver's door open and positioned myself between the door and the gas pump, ready to jump into my car and drive away quickly if necessary. The truck driver appeared to be in his late 30s or early 40s, with a medium build that I estimated at around 170 pounds. As an 18-year-old, weighing only 125 pounds with little muscle mass, I knew I would be at a severe disadvantage in any physical confrontation. The first words out of the truck driver's mouth confirmed my worst fears about his intentions. He told me I was a pretty thing, using language that made it clear his interest in me was entirely inappropriate. My mind raced through various escape scenarios as I tried to remain calm and avoid provoking him into more aggressive behavior. I managed a polite thank you, hoping to discourage further conversation while I finished pumping gas. He offered to pay for my fuel, but I declined immediately, explaining that my parents had provided me with money for the trip. I was genuinely worried that accepting his offer might create some sense of obligation or give him an excuse to expect something in return. His subsequent questions about my background, my destination, and my travel plans triggered every instinct I had developed about personal safety. A voice in my head began repeating the same advice over and over: lie about everything. I fabricated answers to all of his questions, providing false information about my college, my hometown, my family, and my travel plans. I was determined not to give him any accurate details that he might use to track me down later or to find me if I managed to escape from the immediate situation. The gas pump finished its cycle after dispensing only $12 worth of fuel, giving me the excuse I needed to end the encounter. I thanked him politely for his concern, climbed quickly into my car, and drove away as fast as I could without appearing to panic. I watched my mirrors carefully to ensure he wasn't following me, and I was relieved to see that he remained at the gas station as I returned to the highway. I never saw the truck driver again, and I will never know whether his intentions were limited to inappropriate flirtation or if he had planned something much more sinister. The incident taught me to be extremely cautious when traveling alone and to trust my instincts. When someone's behavior makes me uncomfortable, I deeply regret not reporting the encounter to police, as he may have approached other young women in similar circumstances, and my description might have helped protect them from potential harm. Story 21. The Highway Speed Demon. Several months after my first frightening encounter with a truck driver, I experienced another incident that reinforced my growing wariness of traveling alone on highways. I was driving back to college from a visit with my parents, a 2-hour journey I had made numerous times without incidents. On this particular trip, I was using my father's small pickup truck, which felt reliable and familiar despite being considerably older than most vehicles on the road. The day was pleasant, and I was enjoying the drive while listening to music on the radio. I tend to sing along with songs I like, and I often find myself dancing a bit in my seat when a particularly catchy tune comes on. I wasn't paying close attention to other drivers around me, so I was somewhat embarrassed when I noticed a large semi-truck in the rightmost lane traveling at exactly the same speed as my truck in the leftmost lane. Feeling self-conscious about being caught in what I call my dork mode of singing and dancing, I stopped my musical performance and attempted to speed up so the truck driver wouldn't be able to observe my behavior any longer. To my surprise and growing irritation, he matched my increased speed perfectly, maintaining his position relative to my truck despite my efforts to outdistance him. When I glanced over at the truck's cab, I was startled to see that the driver was smiling broadly and waving at me enthusiastically. Unsure how to respond to this unexpected friendliness, I offered a tentative wave back, thinking it was just a harmless moment of highway camaraderie. I quickly realized that acknowledging his attention had been a serious mistake. The truck driver moved from the right lane to the middle lane, positioning himself closer to my vehicle, and continued his persistent smiling and waving. I tried to remain polite and occasionally waved back, reasoning that it was better to maintain a friendly demeanor with someone operating a vehicle that vastly outweighed my small pickup truck. However, my primary focus was on finding a way to safely escape from his unwanted attention. I attempted various driving strategies to break free from his persistent shadowing. I accelerated to about 90 miles per hour, which was near the maximum speed my father's old truck could achieve. But the semi-truck matched my pace effortlessly. One then tried sudden deceleration, slowing down as quickly as I dared without endangering drivers behind me, but he adjusted his speed accordingly and maintained his relative position. The truck driver demonstrated considerably more skill at aggressive highway maneuvering than I possessed. When other vehicles appeared in his lane, he would move to different lanes at the last possible moment, pass the slower traffic quickly, and return to his position beside me before I could slow down enough to fall behind other cars. He was using the presence of other vehicles to help him maintain his unwanted escort of my truck. Throughout this increasingly frightening game of highway cat and mouse, which continued for approximately 5 miles, the truck driver maintained his disturbing smile and continued waving at me. He also repeatedly held up one finger, making a number 1 sign that I couldn't understand or interpret. His initial charm, if it could be called that, was rapidly disappearing as his behavior became more obviously predatory and threatening. Growing genuinely frightened by his persistent stalking, I decided to call 911 for assistance. I provided the emergency operator with a detailed description of the truck. A white cargo trailer with a black cab decorated with some kind of Pennsylvania Company logo. I described the driver as a balding, middle-aged man with tanned skin wearing a dirty blue t-shirt. The operator advised me to pull off onto the emergency shoulder on the left side of the highway, but I had never attempted such a maneuver, and the shoulder looked too narrow for me to feel safe. While I was speaking with the dispatcher, the truck driver passed another vehicle in the middle lane, finally giving me an opportunity to slow down and merge 2 lanes to the right, putting some distance between us. I accelerated past him as quickly as possible, hoping to prevent him from trapping me again with his superior maneuvering skills. The operator directed me to take the next service plaza, about 5 miles ahead, assuring me that the truck driver probably wouldn't follow me there. She suggested I could wait at the plaza for a few minutes before resuming my journey, and she promised that officers would be dispatched if he did follow me. Despite my efforts to conceal my intentions by not using turn signals until the last moment, the truck driver somehow anticipated my plan to exit at the service plaza. He braked hard and merged behind me at the very last second, following me off the highway with a precision that suggested he had been expecting my move all along. The service plaza was designed with separate facilities for trucks and regular passenger vehicles. Semi-trucks were required to use a winding access road that led to a parking area behind the main building, while cars could park directly in front of the plaza. As I explained the situation to a new emergency operator, I watched in horror as the truck slowly navigated its designated route, while the driver stared directly at me with his persistent, increasingly menacing smile. The truck driver's knowledge of my exact parking location made it clear that staying in that spot would be dangerous. I worried that he would be able to find me easily when he completed his route to the truck parking area. Although I was tempted to return to the highway immediately, I was afraid he would see me leaving and resume his pursuit, potentially creating an even more dangerous situation. I decided to drive to a gas station located to the left of the plaza, positioning myself where I could observe the truck parking lot while hopefully remaining less visible to the driver. The emergency operator transferred my call back to the original dispatcher, who informed me that police units had been dispatched, but couldn't provide an estimated arrival time. From my new position, I watched the truck driver exit his vehicle and begin walking toward the main plaza building, apparently searching for me. Even though my doors were locked and my windows were closed, I felt extremely vulnerable and frightened. When I pointed my phone at him to show him I was in contact with authorities, he finally stopped smiling, but his retreat into the plaza building was only temporary. I soon spotted him hiding behind a large white pillar in front of the building, continuing to watch me from his concealed position. His persistent stalking behavior was becoming increasingly frightening, and I asked the operator about the whereabouts of the police officers and whether I should consider leaving the area. She advised me to remain where I was because help should arrive momentarily. The truck driver emerged from his hiding place and began walking directly toward my truck again. I put the vehicle in drive and prepared to flee, updating the operator on his movements while refusing to make direct eye contact with him. He had resumed his disturbing smile, and he began walking in circles around my truck, examining it as if he were looking for potential points of entry. I reached my breaking point when he completed one of his circles and moved behind my truck. I floored the accelerator and drove away immediately, telling the operator that I couldn't wait any longer for police assistance. She apologized for the delay and assured me that officers would look for the man and speak with him if they located him, advising me to focus on getting home safely, while remaining alert for any signs that he might still be following me. The incident taught me that dangerous situations can develop quickly, and that being a young woman traveling alone creates vulnerabilities that I had never fully appreciated. I never learned whether the police found and questioned the truck driver, but the experience left me with a lasting awareness that some people view a woman driving alone as an opportunity rather than simply another traveler sharing the highway. Story 22. The Creature at the Rest Stop. Of all the strange encounters I've experienced during my decade of truck driving, one of the most disturbing occurred just a few weeks ago at a remote rest stop. This incident stands out not because of its supernatural nature, but because it involved something that seemed to be a living creature. Though unlike anything I had ever seen or heard described in nature documentaries or scientific literature, I was traveling through a particularly desolate stretch of highway during the late evening hours when I made contact with another truck driver via CB radio. He was approximately 10 miles ahead of me on the same route, and we struck up a conversation about road conditions and potential delays. These communications between drivers are common and help us look out for each other during long hauls through unfamiliar territory. Our casual conversation took a dramatic turn when he informed me about a rollover accident that was being cleared ahead. A rollover, in trucking terminology, refers to a vehicle that has left the roadway and flipped over, usually requiring significant time and equipment to clear from the scene. I thanked him for the advance warning, which would allow me to adjust my schedule and potentially find an alternate route if necessary. However, his voice suddenly changed from its previous relaxed tone to one of fear and urgent concern. He explained that he had just pulled into a rest stop, the same one I was approaching, and would reach in about 8 miles, and had witnessed something highly unusual and disturbing walking around the facility. He had planned to take a much-needed rest after 8 continuous hours of driving, but whatever he had seen made him afraid to leave his truck or even attempt to sleep. I could hear the genuine fear in his voice as he told me he needed to keep watching the creature to monitor its movements and behavior. His obvious distress was contagious, and I found myself becoming increasingly anxious about what I might encounter when I reached the rest stop. I offered to help by taking shifts watching for the creature once I arrived, which seemed to provide him with some comfort and relief. He began describing what he was observing, and his account was unlike anything I had ever heard. According to his detailed observations, the creature appeared almost human, but with proportions that were distinctly wrong. Its head was noticeably too small for its body, while its torso was unnaturally elongated, creating an appearance that was both familiar and deeply unsettling. The creature was completely naked, but he noted that it lacked any visible genitalia, which added to its alien and disturbing appearance. Its skin appeared to be light gray in color and seemed to be wet or moist, stretched tightly around its frame in a way that made every bone and muscle clearly visible beneath the surface. The overall effect was of something that might once have been human, but had been transformed into something else entirely. My radio contact described watching the creature move around the rest stop area, apparently searching for something by sniffing the air in various locations. When it found what it was seeking, his voice broke as he left the radio briefly to vomit. When he returned to our conversation, He explained in a shaky voice that the creature had discovered a small rabbit somewhere on the grounds. What happened next was so disturbing that I almost wished he hadn't shared the details. The creature had grabbed the rabbit and, with apparently no effort at all, had torn the animal's head completely off its body. Rather than eating the rabbit in any recognizable manner, the creature had proceeded to devour the entire animal, consuming it whole in a display of predatory behavior that was both savage and unnatural. I pushed my truck to its maximum safe speed, desperate to reach the rest stop and provide assistance to my fellow driver. When I finally arrived at the location, I parked as quickly as possible and began scanning the tree line and surrounding areas for any sign of the creature he had described. Despite my careful observation of the entire visible area, I couldn't detect any movement or presence that might indicate where the creature might be hiding. Suddenly, the silence was broken by two sharp gunshots that echoed across the rest stop grounds. I immediately looked around for the source of the shooting and spotted another truck driver, presumably the man I had been speaking with on the radio, firing his weapon at something that was rapidly disappearing into the woods beyond the parking area. The way the creature moved as it fled was unlike anything I had ever observed in nature. It ran on all fours like a quadruped, but its gait was wrong in ways that I struggled to articulate. The movement pattern was irregular and unnatural, suggesting that whatever this creature was, it wasn't designed for the locomotion method it was using to escape from the gunfire. I immediately jumped out of my truck and ran toward the other driver, making sure to announce my presence clearly so he would know I was a friend and not another threat. We met in the middle of the parking area, and he quickly explained that he had finally decided to risk leaving his truck to use the restroom facilities when the creature had appeared just a few feet from the building's entrance. According to his account, the creature had hissed at him aggressively when he emerged from the restroom, then had begun moving toward him in what was clearly a threatening manner. Fearing for his safety, he had drawn his 9mm pistol and fired at the approaching creature. He believed that at least one of his shots had found its target, hitting the creature somewhere in the chest or lung area. His theory about wounding the creature was supported by a trail of black ink-like liquid that led from the spot where the shooting had occurred into the woods where the creature had disappeared. Neither of us had ever seen blood of that color or consistency, which raised additional questions about exactly what kind of creature we were dealing with and where it might have originated. We spent the remainder of the night sleeping in shifts, taking turns, staying awake to watch for any sign that the creature might return to the rest stop. Each of us remained in our respective trucks with doors locked and engines running, ready to flee immediately if the situation became dangerous again. Fortunately, the creature did not reappear, and we made it through until dawn without further incident. That encounter left me with more questions than answers about what exists in the remote areas surrounding our highways. I have never encountered any animal with black blood, and the creature's behavior and appearance didn't match anything in my knowledge of wildlife. The experience has made me much more cautious about stopping at isolated rest stops, particularly during nighttime hours when visibility is limited and help might be far away.